Call us to order at 6:03. Yes. There are hard copies of the end report up here if anybody wants one.
I have a few agendas as well. One more feedback.
It's just agenda. Patrick was just mentioning that Katrina is going to be joining us, but she's at another meeting right now. Does anyone object to us sort of going to the financial or the budget discussion?
Right before that.
Do you want to see the discussion on the drivers and the assumptions, Patrick? You think that, and then that would give Katrina a little time to join us?
Yeah, I mean, we can see where we are with the other
We'll work through
items under executive limitations. And if that goes quickly, as I suspect it might, then we could work into the first item under board management and governance and then come back to the end.
Are there any objections to that?
No.
So we'll just kind of move and flow with it. All right. We do not have a minute taker. So that means somebody has to listen to the meeting afterwards and try and collect it. So
Do you want me to do the minutes?
do you mind? Does it inhibit your ability to
Can
check?
you send me the template, please?
Let's see.
Thank you.
No. I've been doing this a long time. I can type it at the same time, so.
All right.
Thank you. Let me say thank you. I'm starting the minutes. Like I did start putting in some names in, but it's really not my strength and you're excellent. And I could maybe go on and off with you every other one, maybe if that works for you, Chris. Would that be a good deal?
No problem.
Awesome.
Thanks, you too. All right. All right. Tell me when you've got it.
It's sent somewhere in outer space right now.
I got it on my
That's
watch.
pretty-
It's gotta show up on my computer.
So we call, and just be called to order at 6:03.
Okay,
There we go.
thank you, Beth.
All right. Is there any public comment at this time? Any public comment from anyone online? Right. It's just cursor, yeah, I did the same thing. Is that all right? All right, so we'll move on to the consent agenda.
I move to approve the consent agenda.
I'll second.
Is that Chris? or-
Yes.
Okay. All those in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Passed. Okay, so we'll move down to the update financial report. Are there any questions regarding the financial report that was included in the packet? Steve?
The unaudited balance. Is that really $3 million?
No. We're different group of auditors, and they're seeing it a little bit differently than the last auditors, and they're seeing it a little bit differently than our in higher. So we're not quite there yet. That is not the number.
Okay. The number you might hear in this budget update.
That's I pulled it back because there's a wide enough discrepancy from where they are and where we are that it would be impactful going one way or the other.
Okay.
We're going to talk conceptually about fund balance, but with the specific figure being in such flux right now, we thought, let's get that pinned down a little better and bring the real number or a realer number at the next draft.
Is this related to the discrepancy that happened last year? Well,
No.
Are you looking at page 13?
I'm looking at the very first page.
Oh.
There's an unaudited fund balance at the bottom of that sheet.
Oh, yeah.
Any other questions? All right, 2.8, communication and support to the board, safety assessment process preparing to start. Patrick?
Yeah, so for a little context, around this time last year, I think it was maybe a little bit earlier in October, there were some challenging behaviors that created sort of quite a stir in the community, and responses and reactions and concerns that came about from those behaviors. And that sort of prompted a grievance that worked its way through the process up to the board, and sort of resolution to that grievance was to do a pretty thorough kind of SEL safety assessment of the district systems, and sort of asking the question, are there sufficient systems in place to support students to keep a safe working and learning environment for staff and for students? And so through it really took all of last year leading up to the selection of so first of all, articulating with MAEA, what does this assessment look like? What are the deliverables we're looking for from whomever does this? Work that out, a lot of back and forth. Got to a point where we agreed on what those deliverables were. We agreed on who the person would be that would sort of facilitate that, knowing they may need to pull in other resources to do this well. And had hoped to get that launched in the spring. Unfortunately, that was not able to get launched in the spring for a whole host of reasons, but it is ready to launch now. We have teams identified that will start this phase 1 of this assessment. And now it's a matter of picking times and scheduling meetings and getting that launched. So work is about to get underway with that. And the teams are representative of sort of building-based perspectives and district-based perspectives, and classroom teachers, other folks on the teaching contract, administrators, both building level administrator and central office administrator. So really broad representation. It's a group of about 10 people that will sort of work this phase 1, which is essentially outlining the process, ensuring that the right voices are heard, and this group could become sort of a touch point along the way as the process unfolds with other phases. But some of that's going to be determined by this group as they map the work out. So that should get started. I would say there should be a meeting sometime in November, if not even, probably not before that, because that would be a week from today. It's November 1st, I think. So November is likely when the first meeting will start.
Steve?
So is there anybody else now involved from the outside other than the facilitator?
Currently, no. We are working with some folks that could be resources. So we are working this year with Rebecca Lollier from Vermont PBIS, looking at our PBIS systems, which is related to this. We're also working with Dave Melnick, who brings sort of a trauma and stress informed sort of approach to the work. So he could also be a point of contact for the facilitator or the group if that is someone that we can, talk to about our systems and where they're strong and where they need improvement. So outside of the potential for those, right now, the only identified third party is the consultant.
Anyone else?
Yeah, is there any opportunity, or maybe this is what the team will figure out, if there's an opportunity to get input from families?
I think that's part of so there's likely to be some homework assignments in between meetings. And part of those homework assignments will be collecting information from constituents. Presumably families will be a constituent that the group is interested in hearing from, and then we'll figure out what's the mechanism to gather that. So I think it's likely.
Anyone else?
I think important from a sort of an expectations standpoint, I think the various phases of this, like to bring this to completion, we're looking at realistically probably the spring. So it'll be the bulk of this year endeavor. Not really sure of costs. We're working at sort of the typical consultant rate. I expect it will be in the multiple thousands, probably not multiple tens of thousands, but multiple thousands for sure.
Anyone else? All right. Let's move on to SEO updates.
So it's sort of related. It was also around this time last year, it might have been our November meeting, that there was a keen interest on the then board's part, and I recognize the board composition is a little different now, on hearing more about what was happening for SEL supports for students in schools. And that was in a pretty reactive point in time. And so the question that I have with the board is there an interest in hearing updates on what's happening around SEL? And if so, what sorts of things would you be interested in? So that we can map that out and hearing about it from perhaps less reactive and more proactive. I will say along those lines, and this can help inform it, we've identified December 6th as one of our next informational sessions. Of course, we have November 1st, but that's already sort of booked as an informational session for the merger. So the next informational board meeting is December 6th, which is when we had identified that there was an interest in kind of peeling back some of the layers and understanding more sort of the operations of the district. We thought one of the first topics we could bring to that December 6th meeting would be SEL supports. So we can come prepared with that. And if there's something particular that you'd like to learn more about, now would be a good time to know what that is, and we can build up.
Kevin?
How much of that would dovetail into the current previous topic with a consultant to look at behavioral across all the different schools? It seems to like there'd be some connection there.
There would definitely be some connection. Some of the focus in an update would be on what is new or different this year than last year, whereas the assessment might include things that were underway last year as well as what's new. So, but I do think there would be overlap. Timing is the difference, right? If waiting until spring-ish to hear that report is sufficient, that's something that's forthcoming. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like or what the contents will be, but I do think there's likely to be overlap with that. If you wanted something more timely, December 6th is probably the next best date to share more. Because some of what we'll talk about is the work we're doing with Dave Melnick, the work we're doing with Rob PBIS, and other things. And we'll put that in a context, right, which will include some of the things that we've been doing within our multi-tiered system of supports. But we can sort of elaborate on what we shared last year with how things have evolved to this point in time.
Well, my guess is that folks, not just on the board, and hearing, what has changed from last year, even though the assessment is taking maybe longer to get running than we'd all sort of thought it might when we started down this road. So I think a touch base in the interim would be good.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to figure out a regular way to get a sense of what the pulse is in our schools, whether, SEL is a really important one. And I think about, before school gets underway, like, here's what we're doing, or here's what we're planning on, and then in the middle of the year, here's how things are going. Then in the spring, here's how it went this year. And having a process that Like, we regularly do that, and I don't think it needs to be a heavy lift. And I think, you know, we could ask our administrators to figure out the best way to provide that information so that it's not onerous, but that it just keeps us kind of feeling in the know, because otherwise, you know, we might be out in the community and folks are, you know, have questions or asking about different things happening in the schools, and we don't have a sense of sort of overall how things are going, or what we're hoping for, or what we're doing mid-year, or how it went. I think that context is helpful for us. So I don't know what that looks like, and I know it's one more thing to add to what we're asking of our administrators, but I think it could be really helpful to just have some sort of opportunity to hear a little bit more.
I'm curious if there's any data come across schools that would maybe help. So I love hearing like what's going well, but I also think that especially around some of these topics, the data is helpful. Say, oh wow, look, we tried this and look, these things decreased or increased or whatever. And just thinking as far as like budgeting goes, like, do we need to support more in this area as things go? So I think having a December check-in is helpful in my mind when we're working through all those things.
So I think I'm hearing yes, SEL December 6th with data.
Yes, if possible.
Yeah, that's definitely.
I know
fine.
it's short.
Can't imagine we'd present that without data, so I think that's.
That's good,
So we'll move into board management.
Sorry, and could maybe we ask for you to think about what a more sustainable big plan for that kind of thing. So in addition to December 6th, what might that look like? You know, in a year.
And not specific to SEL, I understand, right? Thinking.
No, I mean, I think this, well, I don't know, we have the strategic plan piece, and so I guess maybe this is folding into that, and maybe, I don't know, whatever you think makes sense for board members to have the temperature taking of those different points of view.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that sounds more feasible to me in our future than it necessarily has felt in the past with all the other heavy lifts around governance change, like everything that's been going on. I don't know where the time would have come, even with 2 meetings a month. My sense is there's not a lot of appetite for a 3rd meeting a month, but I think going forward, there may be less conversations around some of the things we've been talking about, which makes great situation of this. So I think mapping that out now seems more feasible. Because the trick is, if we're looking across the system, we're talking about SEL, we could spend the whole board meeting in just on December 6th on SEL alone. So how we map that out across the disciplines would take some time. So we need to have that time available, and we might now have that time available. And my thinking is looking at the board work plan, and thinking about how does it fit within sort of the cadence of that work plan with those information.
Kristen, would something like just like an update letter suffice for that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't,
I'm sort of thinking like, I think we've talked about it a couple times where instead of like presenting something, it's really provided as information.
yeah, right, and I think that's what I mean, but it
So
doesn't.
it
have to
doesn't
be
take up a
heavy-
whole board meeting. It doesn't
Right.
require somebody
Right,
come to the meeting and present it. It's just included in the agenda.
like, for example, I know, you know, I think we're all aware last year was really hard across the country with behavior issues in schools and in the health district too. And, you know, so knowing, hearing from building administrators or your team, oh, here's a couple things we are planning to do to tackle this at Mount Abe, or to tackle this at, Bristol, or whatever it is. And then we, get a sense of, yeah, that's going well, or that's, there's some tweaking, or,
December 6th could be kind of a real primer on it. But then an update, which could happen. I think would just be an update on these topics. How is the assessment going? And what's the temperature of the SEL status?
That wouldn't become like a monitoring report type thing in the end, would it?
I think it would be more of a 2.8 communication support to the board than it would be really a monitoring. And it could be evidence of 2.8 from a monitoring perspective, but I think that's where it would live.
And then,
Be more like the financial report.
yeah,
We get that every month. Give a chance to ask a question about it. It's not the big-
So I'm imagining routine written updates would be higher level updates. Anything we want to go in depth on really needs a presentation and discourse to set the context and help folks really understand what we're talking about. So
Right.
That's what I'm trying to imagine what that would look like going forward. We still have some number of times. I think we've set 3 this year for some of the more in-depth updates. And then it's in addition to those that we might have monthly written higher level updates.
maybe, maybe we try something and it's not quite what we need or want, but I just feel like we didn't have as much communication last fall, and that was hard. So how can we do that differently?
we'd also been talking during that time about possibly being able to go into the school and sort of having an understanding about that, about being able to meet with the principals and that kind of thing. I'd really like that to be the case. Being able to have open discussions with the principal and things like that. I think that might help us in these discussions that we're saying, where we're asking them to give us information 3 times a year, but I think it might also be good to have sort of a personal linkage with them.
Any last thoughts? Need more information?
No, not to get started. I think to Chris's point, getting started is the hard part, and we can work from there and react to efforts and kind of adjust along the way.
Now we'll move down to board management and governance. The discussion around anticipated budget drivers and assumptions. I guess we'll start there.
Yeah, so context setting here. The theme of uncharted territory continues. I think we've been living in that for a while. And it certainly continues in our budget development this year. So we, as you all know, we've had to build contingency budgets in light of a lack of a decision from the State Board of Education around the status with Lincoln. So trying to think about how do we present to you multiple budgets, in particular, knowing there's some board members that haven't been through the budget building process yet. So a lot of it's going to be foreign, which is complicated. And then we're going to complicate that even further by giving variations of what you've seen in the past. So what Floyd and I have been working, I dare say feverishly, for what we'll have now to prepare for you tonight, is an MAUSD, 5 towns, as it has been the last several years when we've been building budgets. We thought starting with what is familiar made sense in terms of a grounding when we're talking about what are the assumptions behind the numbers and and their impact. We worked from there to start sharing some of the contingencies, which include an MAUSD that is a 4-town supervisory district, so not in an SU, but just a 4-town district, and its impact. We then worked through, in a supervisory union, what would the supervisory union or SU, what would that budget be, those expenses, super high level? And what then would the subsequent MAUSD that is a 4-town district in a supervisory union budget be? And we went so far as to not exclude the other member in this SU, which is what would a Lincoln school district budget be, factoring in the SU assessment that would go to Lincoln based on the SU budget. Historically, when we've been a supervisory union, we present the SU budget to the SU board, we present the MAUSD budget to the MAUSD board, and we present the Lincoln budget to the Lincoln board. That's how we would do it if we were an SU. We're not an SU right now. You're the only board I work for. So we share all of those with you as we think about the contingencies.
So don't get too bogged down in all those, because next month, there it is. Some could be eliminated.
Right, hopefully all but one of these options will be eliminated after next month. And I think it's important, as we consider what the state board is going to do, and as the state board considers what they're going to do, and as Lincoln considers what the state board is going to do, that to the extent that we can right now, with lots of moving parts still, try to make some projections about what's the impact of these various budgets, all of which have some degree of possibility, including a 5-town. There's an agenda later on about talking about that.
If we're right now trying to focus on what percentage we should ask you to shoot for as a target, does that vary based on these scenarios? In other words, can we just focus on that part
Wouldn't
and
that
have
be
it
nice?
apply generally to those other, for now at least? Right now, you just need that guidance from us.
Right, so this is all in service to giving you enough information to give us a budget target to hit.
Right.
And the impact is pretty significantly different depending on the variety of options. And so while you might feel comfortable with X percent increase in the cost per equalized pupil in one scenario, when you understand what that would mean in another scenario, your comfort level may be different. I think that's what makes it hard to just pick the one blanket and it applies to each. That was my initial thinking, that the target could be the same no matter what. And maybe it will be, but it has a substantially different impact depending on the scenario that plays out. And I just think it's important to understand what that impact could be.
Kevin,
So you mentioned a Lincoln budget. Is that done in a vacuum or is that done with conversation with Lincoln?
It's with conversation with Lincoln, and it's actually the budget Lincoln gave us that they built absent an SU assessment. And so as we worked the SU expenses and built in sort of an allocation of those expenses, it includes that, which then rounds out that budget.
I have another question. And so through when we got the Levinson report, he had remarked about all the different line items and work to change to a much more concise budget structure, if you will. Are we doing that?
We will be. So typically we see that as we get closer to the annual meeting. So what you're seeing is our slides like you've seen in the past that sort of summarize all of the lines and talk about the impact at a higher level. When we actually develop the detailed budget, that will be the forward-facing budget, we're going to lean on Nate's recommendations on how to organize that. But that's a little bit down the road, probably December-ish is when we would start to see the draft of that. So then December, January, and ideally in that January meeting, we're both approving the budget, but also we're approving the format in which that budget is going to be forward facing to the community at the annual meeting in February.
It would be a pretty big lift to do all of these budgets revamped. Once we get a sense of where we're going, then that makes it really easy, not easy. We get to focus on one budget and transitioning it to that format. I love the format, and it would seem to be not a waste of time, but not the best use of our time to go develop that format for something that the state board says, yeah, that's not gonna happen. Makes sense.
So Patrick, I wonder with the people who haven't gone through this process, if we could just start with, when you start building a budget, you take this information and you sort of slide it ahead to
Sure.
this year. And
So typically for a meeting like tonight's meeting, which really the goal is to get a budget target from the board that we then strive to hit. We start with, if we didn't reduce staff, occasionally there's one or two things that we can anticipate for next year, and we'll build that in. But generally speaking, if we take all of our current programming, supports, personnel, et cetera, and roll it forward with assumptions about what's going to happen with healthcare, what's going to happen with salaries, what's going to happen with other expenses. For example, this year, historically, we've used, I think, a 2% increase, thinking about inflation for all lines that are not really directly tied to something else. In the current economic climate, a 2% increase at rate of inflation is probably quite low. So this year we used 5%. So there's one driver behind this. We know what teaching salaries will be because we have a settled contract, so that's helpful. We have information from the state about what's going to happen with healthcare insurance. What we're told is budget 12.5% increase in the premium. So that's an assumption that's built into this and is a driver behind some of these expenses. But it's essentially no real substantive programmatic change. It's keeping what we have, moving it all forward with what we know. And that gives you a basis to say, all right, so that's what keeping status quo essentially looks like from a financial impact. How comfortable are we or aren't we with what that means and what would go before voters? If it's comfortable, then all right, the target is relatively set. If it seems like it's too high, then you'd set a target that lowers that. That is a rate that you're comfortable bringing to the voters. But that's the idea, is first roll it all forward. And then we make assumptions about what's the revenue going to be, because the bottom line figure really is the cost per equalized pupil. The way you get that is you take your expenses, which is that process of rolling everything forward, subtract out your revenue, which we make assumptions about what we expect to receive. And the difference is your education spending. And that figure gets divided by your equalized pupil count. And that gives you your cost per equalized pupil, which drives your tax rate. And so that's sort of the structure behind what you're looking at here. And part of what this would show is, like, it'll show some about what the class size would look like next year compared to now with those assumptions that we're talking about. Kind of peels back some of the layers so you have an understanding of what a potential impact might be as you think about setting a target. Yeah. Enough of an overview.
I think so. I mean, I've looked to the.
I'll forgo setting the tax rate calculation. That we'll just get to the
That's-
cost per
that's
equalized pupil.
way
Yep.
further along in the process.
Yeah.
I'm looking to the newer people, can you wrap your head around that piece?
I was gonna say, I'm just gonna make that recommendation. If we dive in, that may offer some of the specifics that'll help people wrap their head around it. All right, so here we go. And I think everybody can see a screen.
Can you minimize the Zoom?
Oh, yeah.
Just
Just tap the left hand.
Oh, sorry.
bar.
I did it on my screen, but that's the wrong screen.
I guess if you're a board member, just unmute and ask your question. We might as well be able to see that.
Because we won't be able to.
All right, so the first one we're gonna take a look at, as I said, is what we've been using for the last several years. And this is a way to sort of ground us in what's familiar. And we like to start with what are the assumptions that are built into this. So this assumes a reduction of one classroom teacher at Robinson. I've been in conversations with Adora about this for a while. The enrollment decline is intended to, or expected to continue. So this is a reaction to that. And you'll see what the class size impact is for next year with that. I mentioned the 12.5% increase in healthcare. This does assume a reduction of 23.5 equalized pupils. We don't get that number until theoretically January sometime, or December, sometimes later than that.
Today settled the waiting. Oh, yeah.
Understanding it, I think, is, yes, it's settled, and understanding it is still forthcoming, I think. I know Floyd's been reaching out a bunch, but I don't think we have crystal clarity yet.
It will be. To oversimplify it, they're working the last 3 years to show what this year would be if it were implemented, with an eye towards doing the same thing next year and then implementing for 26.
So they're using the old formula.
They are.
This is the old formula for equalized pupil count, yeah.
We think they are.
Right. And so this does also not include anything about a spending threshold or penalty. I do have some slides in here that speak to if we had a threshold and our assumptions about what the threshold would be, where would we be in relation to that. I think it's important to keep an eye on that as the years go forward, because right now it's on hiatus until FY29. But unless you think there will be no spending limits set at some point in time, we might as well pay attention to the limit that is most recent and is the best guess we have. But at least keeps us in the ballpark. I don't think we want to find ourselves in FY29 having paid no attention to any spending threshold, and then we're millions of dollars over, and all of a sudden we've got to do something about it.
So we have a decline in students in Robinson. But we also have a reduction of 23 equalized pupils, so there's still reduction in other places. But it doesn't impact classroom teachers.
I think it'll become clear when we look at the class sizes. It's interesting because you can have a school could lose 7 students over the year prior, and that doesn't necessarily translate into needing one less teacher, because it might be a student or 2 in the 3rd grade and 2 in kindergarten, and 1 somewhere else. And so, a teacher experiencing 1 less student than they had last year doesn't, eliminate the need for that. So it sort of is it tends to be kind of a trickle down effect. And then the trickle down has gotten to a significant enough place where now's the time to reduce a position in light of that.
And then at junior high and high school level.
So that starts to get more complicated. I think that's going to be in the years forthcoming. Right now it's complicated because unless we have to make those reductions to hit a target, we're at a point where those reductions at the secondary level don't just increase class sizes, they decrease programs. And so we've done everything we can to date to try and prevent reducing programming. I think we can do that going forward for 1 more year, and especially to buy some time to see what's going to happen with our future. And with this decline we've seen in the elementary schools working its way through the secondary, we will not be able to avoid program reductions without something significant changing for us. Status quo going forward, losing a significant percentage of kids at Mount Abe is going to reduce programming for students. It's unavoidable unless we think big. And then so we make some assumptions in here about what happens with revenue. A lot of this revenue, this one actually doesn't. I was going to say this revenue might be attributable to anticipated tuitioning in from Lincoln, but this is not the scenario that would have that happen. So there are other factors that lead to this, which starts to get into the weeds there.
Sorry.
Oh, the block grant impact, okay.
Does that bullet mean that revenue will be around that amount, or revenue will be some amount plus?
Right, so revenue would be what we are expecting this year plus 257,000. So that's to the good, 257.
Sorry, I'm
This
thinking
is
fund
all-
balance. I got mixed up.
This is all Act 170.
Yeah. So when we have more clarity on what happens with what we'll have for a fund balance, we can talk about that. In any event, in this scenario, my recommendation would be that we use the entire fund balance to put into the capital reserve and ed reserve. Again, just that positions us well for the future in terms of not somewhat artificially inflating revenue by whatever amount we put in to offset taxes, but it also builds those coffers for capital needs and education reserves. So as we get that figure, that will be my recommendation for this scenario for those reasons. And you'll see the tax rate projections, et cetera, on this soon, which will usually that has an impact, right? If we don't want to make the reductions necessary to hit the budget target, a way we can not make the reductions and hit the target is apply a fund balance to offset taxes and lower that. And it's risky. So this is looking at enrollment by school from FY18 to FY24 using projections for FY24. And it really just articulates what we're experiencing in terms of that decline. It's not quite as steep as it has been, and it's still happening nonetheless. The asterisk on Lincoln just recognizes that there are currently 3 students at Lincoln Community School that are on tuition waivers from MAUSD. So in Lincoln's separation, something's going to have to be decided on what that means for those students. This 65, since we're talking about a 5-town district, as it has been in the past, assumes they would stay at Lincoln Community School because we're still all MAUSD. You'll see some other slides that make different assumptions about what happens with those 3 students.
Is that a typo at the end of even?
92, that is not a typo at the end of being the projections, and we're still projecting. So the projections for incoming kindergarten are 19, Travis? 19. And we have a really small, so 19 incoming kindergarten, and the current 6th grade class is 6. So that's an anticipated delta of plus 13, which brings you from 79 to 92.
The FY23 an accurate number about who's actually there.
Yep, I had actually had a report run today that pulled FY23. So that's accurate based on what's in the system today. And so what that means for class sizes, thinking about our class size policy, which is the slide after this, you can see what the current averages are for those categories, K2, 3, 6, and then just sort of overall as a school and what they're projected to be. And important to note that the figures, I guess I missed an asterisk here, for Robinson next year, take into account that reduction of a classroom teacher that we were talking about.
Question of class
Sure.
size. So the class size thought is that if it's over 20, that it splits.
So these are the class size guidelines that influence sort of conversations around class size. It's not quite as clean as if there's 20 it splits. In fact, I would say usually no, we would not split a class of 20.
Okay, so I guess my question is, currently in Moncton, there's kindergarten and 2-1-2s, but the 1st grade class is 27.
Mhm.
So when they join together for math and phonics, there's 27 kids in one classroom for those subjects. And that doesn't feel like it kind of goes with our plan.
Yeah.
So I just didn't know if that was just kind of a fluke for a year, or if that's kind of like the trend moving forward, that stuff would happen more and more.
No, so and we're starting to get into the nuances of particular cohorts. So a cohort of 27 in Moncton is an anomaly.
Yeah.
Mostly they're in the 18, 19, 20 range,
Mhm.
some even a little bit lower. And so that does create some challenges sometimes in how do we navigate that. So what you're seeing here are sort of homeroom, if you think about it that way,
Mhm.
where you mentioned the 2-1-2s.
Yeah.
So that breaks that 27 up a little differently so that there isn't so many bodies in the same
Okay.
space. Choices are made for good reason to group those 27 by grade for certain skill development. And it's in those cases where we have more student bodies, and we try to really strategize getting additional adults in there to help as well. And that's a good example of how it's not so clean cut as,
Right, that's why I wasn't sure if that was kind of like the new plan.
right?
We have bigger class sizes, what would happen? But
What
that
we
makes
would
sense.
likely not do, unless we found ourselves in some real financial crunch, we wouldn't have 27 second graders in a homeroom together all the time for all of their specials and all of their instruction all day long.
Mhm.
That would be a number that's probably higher than most people are comfortable with
Okay.
in Vermont. I should always contextualize it with in Vermont. I think there are people in other parts of the country that would love 27. And just stop me if you need more time on a slide, or, and this will be, we can link this in the minutes, so you'll have access to the whole thing. So these are the class size guidelines. So these help inform some of those decisions around, whether we add a teacher or reduce a teacher. We have added some teachers. We added a teacher at Bristol and at Beeman this year. We added a kindergarten teacher in Bristol in anticipation of a big kindergarten class that ended up not being a big kindergarten class. So we have really tiny kindergarten classes at Bristol this year. So going forward for next year, we're not anticipating as big a kindergarten class, so we wouldn't continue that position next year. That's not included in here because we were able to use ESSER funds to add that position. Likewise at Beeman, with sort of some class sizes that would have been higher than what we would have been looking for. We added a 1-2, I think, as a teacher at Beeman. What's that? 3-4. To help keep what would be higher than typical class sizes from happening there. Result is we end up with slightly lower than typical. But that felt like that was the right approach to take for this year. Looking at what you see for class sizes here for next year at Beeman, with that uptick that we were talking about before, this assumes, so we went from 4 teachers last year at Beeman to 5 this year. This assumes with that uptick that we keep that 5, and you can still see what the class sizes are looking like there. So I think that seems like a reasonable approach. So now we're getting to the nitty gritty.
So
Yep.
if we're losing a teacher in Robinson, but we're getting one at Beeman, so it's a wash, maybe.
Eventually it will be a wash, depending on decisions we make with ESSER funds. And if we continue to fund the Beeman teacher through ESSER or through something else, we'll determine whether that's a wash or not. This assumes right now that we continue to use ESSER funds, and that may
So
change.
they're not part of the budget essentially.
Right. So the summary here really is the result of everything we talked about, rolling everything forward, all the assumptions that we've made. You can see what our spending and our revenue are, which shows you the education spending. So obviously FY24 is the column in blue. And that really brings us down to what is the cost per equalized pupil and how has that cost changed from last year? And then you can see a historical perspective, because that's what drives the tax rate. And I need to check on this. Historically, there's been a law that says you have to put on the ballot the percent increase from last year on the cost per equalized pupil, in addition to the percent increase in your overall expenditures. There's a new law that I think has changed that I need to brush up on as we approach this. I think we might not be required to share that. But nevertheless, it's going to be what drives the tax rate, and that's something people still care very much about. Historically, I think when you can see 8.1% increase in FY20, that budget passed very narrowly, I think. think that was the 16 vote or something like that. 13. So as we get into that 7 or 8% increase in the cost per equalized pupil, that seems to be historically a figure that voters start to get a little bit kind of questionable about. And so what we're presenting here would be under that. Obviously with lots of assumption not built in.
So this includes the whole preamble of horror stories like the healthcare increase and all those things, and we end up with a 3% increase and 4% equalized student. Based on these projections. This is the 5-town, everything stays the same.
Correct.
This is if Lincoln is part of MAUSD,
As a member town in our district,
as a member town in our district.
as they have been historically in recent history.
Are you?
I'm hoping maybe someday we'll see the different scenarios and just that bottom line, 3%. Or a 3% increase in this scenario.
On one slide, they are not currently on one slide.
I'm gonna make a.
They are
chart
all
right
here.
now for myself.
What you want?
What I want, because I think that's where you were going. I want that too.
All right. So as I mentioned before, paying some attention to what was the spending threshold that is currently on hold until FY29, I think is still something that is valuable.
Yeah.
And if this board agrees, this could become something we pay attention to in terms of setting targets. So everything we just walked through has per student would have us over the spending threshold by just under $18, all told 25,000. That is what we refer to as bug dust in finances. You know, in a $33 million budget, 25 grand is no big deal.
But theoretically, the state would charge us an additional 25,000.
If that same structure is in place in the future that was in the past, exactly.
They don't have a bug plus.
They don't. And frankly, there's no way we would put forth a budget that exceeds the spending threshold by 25 grand. We would find 25 grand and take it out and put a budget forward that is just up.
Yeah.
So
Can
just
you go
talk,
back one more slide? I have to write down a number. Okay.
2593, that number, bottom right hand corner, is the one I want. 593. Okay, that's for equalized people.
correct.
So, check.
So this is where it starts to get into what the tax rate impact would be for each town. And it makes assumptions about what common levels of appraisal would be. And really, I think where it starts to hit the pocketbook is this slide. So everything we just showed with lots of different assumptions would have for the approximately 1/3 of folks who pay their taxes based on the value of their home, we'd be looking in the $30 to $35 range of an increase per 100,000 of assessed value. For folks that pay based on income, which is about 2/3, we'll be looking at, Floyd, help me with this. I'm seeing a projected decrease, and then a projected percent increase.
Yeah, I didn't change IN to DP.
Okay,
The
so this is,
bottom word,
so this would be a decrease in the amount paid for folks that pay based on income.
But that's a sliding scale.
Exactly. So
right?
this uses very specifically the median income from 2020, 70,262. It'll be different for folks that are above that median, but still paying based on income, and different still for folks that are lower than that. So it is absolutely on that sliding scale. This is 1 point on that scale. So the summary here is, without making lots of changes, we have a pretty decent budget that we could put forward to voters that doesn't dramatically increase taxes. There's a takeaway. And it's pretty much right at the spending threshold if we use that as a as a gauge. So now let's take a look at a 4-town scenario. This is not in a supervisory union. This is just
Us alone.
same structure, us on our own, 4 towns.
If I just shake my head for a moment.
Please do.
You just. So the inflation rate doubled. Almost triple, maybe triple. Healthcare is at 12.2. And
Loss of equalized pupils.
loss of equalized people.
I'm sure it's not that bad.
Typically that combination has us looking at an initial, like. Yeah. It's, I'm struggling to figure out where all this good news is.
Well, it's
Yeah.
good news if we stay together.
No, I understand. I'm just saying
But
that
still,
Yeah,
yeah.
but how does
You
that,
this is what I'd want to compare it to and understand that, because it's.
I mean, part of it comes just efficiencies. I mean, we've been together that much longer. We are a little bit more careful with what we're hiring and replacing attrition. Taking advantage of when we can find them.
And makes you feel any better, there's plenty of time to get news from the state that completely changes that.
Yes, I understand,
Hang your hat on this.
but even just what the assumptions are today. Usually plugged into this formula, we're gulping.
Yeah, I'd be totally fine with that.
I was frankly expecting to gulp when I walked in the door.
There's gulping in your future.
Okay,
Okay, we're ready.
This is not the gulping scenario. But we can talk about, we can do a little more digging about, trying to highlight some of the reasons why it's not as bad as you might have been anticipating. We can talk about
yeah,
that next
just
time.
the usual suspects.
oh, one
are-
thing is the plus revenue.
So there's 250 grand.
That's, like,
right.
last year it was.
Okay, so that's
Well,
true.
and
That's a big
the
gap.
way that it's structured in the past with special ed, they had to be completely separate. And now you have a little bit more flexibility to have someone who's on a 504 be part of a group with a special ed student, IEP, and have the same person work with 2 kids at the same time.
And just that 250 grand, right? That makes a 3.5% increase in spending and a 5% increase in the cost per pupil. So that probably is closer, still lower probably than you're anticipating, but closer to what you were maybe thinking I was going to say. But we can try to point some of those things out. And I would say with the caveat, if this is a scenario that we're going to present again in the future. My hope is that of all the scenarios we're presenting, this is the only time we present them all. And from this point forward, we present one, we just don't know which one.
Okay.
So now we're looking at 4-town supervisory district, not a supervisory union. And all the same assumptions that we talked about in the prior example would stand true. This also assumes that all of the employees at Lincoln remain with MAUSD. And the reductions that we make, which are equivalent to the FTEs that are at Lincoln currently, happen following our RIF process, which is from the least senior. So
Sad.
the options were really assume they all stay or assume they all go. They're all currently MAUSD employees. It's more conservative to assume they all stay. And we thought that was probably the prudent approach to take in building this 4-town option.
So that doesn't have anything to do with, I think it's gonna happen this way, it's just the conservative approach. Because I mean,
Right, this is not-
you hear in the scandal sheet that all these teachers are happy up there and they're gonna stay. You know?
And that might well be true. It really came down to, we don't know. The likelihood of every single person staying or every single person leaving is next to none. It's going to be some mixture, and how could we possibly begin to anticipate what the mixture is going to be? So we take the conservative approach that they all stay and run the numbers with that assumption.
So I just want to make sure I understand that correctly. So you're saying that this assumption is that everybody that works at Lincoln would come to one of our other 4 town schools, and Lincoln will hire all new people.
Correct.
And then
Unlike-
we would have to shift all that, okay.
And
But in
then,
terms of picking a set of numbers, that's the approach.
And then you would apply a RIP structure to get back down to the.
Correct.
so then the 4 people or whatever in Lincoln, 5, I don't know how many would put that number of people out the door. In the district.
And it's more than that when you factor in shared staff and other things.
But you're just trying to figure out what salary is level.
We just needed to get a total dollar number to make some assumptions and build into this budget.
We're ready.
I was just wondering if you can tell us when you show the numbers, like what that range would, I know you don't know the number, but like,
How much could it swing the other way?
yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
how significant is that conservative
Yeah,
estimate? Because it'll paint one picture, and if it's really different from another picture, that makes it hard to gauge.
well, to give you a
versus
sense,
somewhere
right?
In the middle.
It'll be somewhere between this, right? So the difference between a most veteran teacher and a least veteran teacher is a most veteran teacher is almost 2x what a least veteran teacher is from a salary perspective. Benefits cost the same regardless of where you are. So from a straight salary perspective, that's the potential swing. Again, it won't be either of the extremes, it'll be somewhere in between. I couldn't tell you which way. Lincoln has essentially a pretty veteran staff, so this, and obviously if we're riffing the least senior people, that's why this is a conservative approach. If anything, it would be better than what we're projecting.
Is this what we
You're
looked
gonna have
at
to- you're gonna have to
when we
rip
talked
twice.
about like the income? Is that the same approach that you use?
I think this is. Yeah, this would be the assumption that we would make for any budgeting that we did. So when we try to be as conservative as we can within, a reasonable. Sort of range when we're building any of these budget assumptions, so.
So you have to rip almost twice as many people.
Yeah, or the same and experience less savings. Or,
Oh, yeah, right.
but to get,
Do it.
to achieve a fixed savings that you might be targeting, it is more people that are on the least senior end than you would if you were ripping on them. So I would recommend the same for a fund balance. I'm trying to keep the same structure, so if somebody goes to one of these, it has sort of the complete picture, so you're gonna see some redundancy, and I'll go through those quickly. So same idea with the classes, a couple of asterisks here, as we've been talking, the Mount Abe total assumes 75% of Lincoln students grades 7 through 12 at town Mount Abraham. Lincoln hasn't made a decision on what they're gonna do for their secondary level. Essentially, unless they designate Mount Abe as the one secondary school, I think we need to anticipate that we will receive fewer students from Lincoln than we currently do. Everything I've been hearing points toward choice 7-12. And it's with those assumptions that we're thinking, at least to start, 75% is conservative, but probably the number we should be budgeting to expect. 75% of the 7-12 students that are in Lincoln would come to Mount Abe. Will likely be more than that, but when you build budgets, you don't build what you hope will happen, you build what you conservatively estimate. That's what that is. The other asterisk addresses that statement I made before about what happens with the students that are on tuition waiver. This now assumes, because this is a scenario that does not include Lincoln, that those students that are on tuition waiver come back into the school in the town where they reside. It didn't make sense to assume a decision by the Lincoln School District to continue a tuition waiver for students. It's certainly an action they could take, not an assumption that made sense to make right now. And again, it's a total of 3 students, so it's not really significant. Class sizes, a slight change from what you saw before in a couple of schools where those 3 students are going to be distributed in, but very incremental changes here. Class size guidelines again. And this is that budget. So this is now obviously reduced expenditures because there are costs associated with Lincoln that were in the first scenario that are not in this scenario. There is an increase in revenue because we would be expecting tuition dollars for those 75% of the 7 to 12 students that would be coming into Mount Aid from Lincoln. So that gives us this education spending of $26,337,000. This, of course, shows a reduction in equalized pupil count because we would not be counting the equalized pupils that are in Lincoln. And that math
don't get to
reduces
count the
this
tuition
cost.
students, right?
What's that?
And you don't get to count the tuition students.
You don't need to count the tuition students
You
either.
don't
get to-
you don't get to.
No, so the Lincoln School District gets to count all of their students K-12 towards their equalized pupil. And then they tuition their 7-12 to wherever they go. We're presuming 75% of Mount Aid, and that shows up as a revenue.
So the state's not funding the equalized people because we're getting it as tuition.
And that's why, assuming 75%, although probably conservative, at least at first, is the prudent thing to do here, because if we assume 90% and it's 80, we're eating the difference. Like, we didn't budget that. And so there's an expense that we didn't account for. So that's why we take that conservative approach, because it amounts to $20,000 a kid when you're off. So I'd rather be off in a way that's conservative than off in a way that is not.
So it does affect us.
Mhm.
So the vote or the fact that it wouldn't affect us, it does.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way. The effect is minimized a bit. But it definitely does have an impact.
So no.
Well, I guess that goes back to what I was trying to ask my earlier question, because when we looked at or Lincoln withdrew, what the impacts would be. I'm trying to understand that those numbers and these numbers. Like, for example, with 75% going to that meeting, is that what we estimated then, or was it 80?
I think we might have used 80.
I think it was
At the
either
time.
85, it may have been 90 initially, based on the feedback coming from Lincoln. And with their conversation swinging to choice in their discussions. Where it ends, I'm not sure, but there doesn't seem to be discussion with the Lincoln School District in designating Mount Aid as the receiving school. And with the lack of that being the direction, CBU's close, Middlebury's close.
Right, but does that
Mount
account
Vernon
for
is not that far.
the plus 6.51? Is that the entirety of that difference there? Or is it
So
how
that's-
many students from coming on Aid?
No, that wouldn't equate to that kind of difference. We could dig into what was the difference, in particular, if this is the scenario that moves forward, trying to articulate what that is. And some of it is close to a year's time-ish has passed, and we know more and things are different. But there may be something more to that we can look into.
So this is the SU scenario, right?
This is not
Not
SU.
SD.
This
Just
is
linking off on their own.
making
Yes.
off on their own, and MAUSD has 4
Okay, so
towns.
there's
on its own.
there's no SU assessment to add on.
Correct.
Kevin.
So there's a delta increase for equalized pupil, but I don't see a delta increase for ed spending.
Right, so the ed spending is lower than in the 5 towns, but you're dividing by a much smaller equalized pupil count, which is what increases your cost for equalized pupil. Because we're down, I think we lost 172 equalized pupil is the estimate for Lincoln. So that 1247 is 172 less than in the 5 town scenario that we just walked through.
Or maybe I didn't ask. So the first slide we had 3% overall. is that overall expenses or overall expenses?
Expenses, not ad spend.
Okay, and then this slide, I didn't copy that one, so I don't know what the percent
So
change is.
we don't have it because there is no four-town history to compare to.
5 was 387.
So we had a five-town history to compare to in terms of a percent increase over the prior year.
Okay,
Okay.
Bailey?
Tuitioning students, is that just a general amount per student, or is there extra? Let's say you have a student who needs a lot of extra supports and services, does that student get?
We charge them.
Do you charge them more? How does that work?
Good question. I don't know if you have the answer to that, Floyd. I know from a bigger picture tuition standpoint, this board sets a tuition rate. And that's sort of what's billed out. But then at the end of the year, it gets trued up with the actual tuition cost. So I'm wondering if it's within that truing up that there might be.
So the sending
Total
town, when it's trued up, the sending town covers the rest of the costs.
Yeah, and that's so I can only speak to it from a historical perspective, and I don't know if it's changed. I have worked as an administrator in a school that received tuition students from another district. Students that were on IEPs, we got sort of the base tuition amount. And depending on the services they were accessing, we had a formula that we calculated what percentage of the overall cost of the services were specific to that student. If there were 5 students in the program and the program was 200,000, we did that math and that was added on to that base amount.
I guess my concern is because of the change in the special ed funding to block grant, what that would look like. Because it's a lot harder to chunk out how much was spent on who
Yes.
with the block grant.
Do you want to speak to that just a little bit with what we're working through with the state on right now?
I'll turn to the board. There are an endless number of rabbit holes we can go down and more weeds than you can count.
I think we
Sounds like
ought
a
to
parking
know.
lot.
Yeah, yeah, just had a hold on that and just get through this without getting too deep in it.
Maybe when there's
because-
one version we're
Yeah,
presenting.
right, right.
Okay.
I agree.
You can, don't get bogged down in 5 right now.
So to Kevin's point earlier, we do have comparisons on the cost per equalized pupil because all formulas lead to cost per equalized pupil. So we can show for every one of these scenarios, the delta in that cost per equalized pupil from what is this year's cost per equalized pupil compared to next year in these various scenarios. So that becomes a basis of comparison. And for each of the scenarios, I put this together, which I think also kind of summarizes for you what happens. So this is what we're projecting in an MUSD for town with all the assumptions that we just talked about. So there's some of what I think I promised Steve earlier.
Now, just in terms of, well, I guess you want to go through the tax rate thing for all. That's really where the room.
Right. So let's talk about taxes. I'm gonna go through these slides pretty quickly because I think like this is important information and this is what it means. So this is where I'll go to more quickly. So again, for the 1/3 or so of folks that pay based on the value of their home, it's a little less than twice the impact, but still something that this is not unprecedented for tax impact historically for us at 61.5, $60 to $65 per $100,000.
And bear in mind, we're coming off a year, for fiscal year 23, with the yield was substantially more favorable than anybody projected.
Yep. That's a big piece to
So
this.
if you're looking at 22 to 23, we were flat or down with the exception of Starksboro because of the CLA there.
And then again, for assuming the median income, it's quite flat. Was a decrease in the other flat in this. So those are the two budgets that are not supervisory union. You're now going to see three budgets that are all under the SU. As in an SU, there'd be an SU budget, a Lincoln budget, and an MNA budget. So those are the three budgets that make up the next one scenario, if you can follow that. So,
Hang on, don't get stuck in it, just listen.
so central office, and I put in parentheses, purchase services. That's effectively what this is, right? Districts purchase services provided by central office. And this is the only slide, just to keep this super simple. So total SU budget, 8,797,000. The apportionment of that and the representative percentages of that apportionment are shown here. This is an attempt to, so this is a hybrid approach. Historically, we have only applied ADM, or average daily membership, which is another way to count students, as the mechanism for distribution of the central office costs. In this scenario where we are not currently an SU, but we would be becoming an SU, we have a different lens to look at impact and sort of a equitable allocation of those centralized costs. So rather than apply ADM to everything, there are some things that can be directly. Like, so if Lincoln runs 3 buses and we know it's $60,000 a bus, there can be a $180,000 assessment directly to Lincoln for those real costs, as opposed to 10% or 14% or some percentage of ADM of the whole district's transportation costs. So when we had information to be able to do that, that's the approach we took. When we really didn't have that kind of information, we used ADM for some things. And there are other things that are somewhere in between. For example, a superintendent's time. With 2 districts and a supervisory union board, a superintendent will not be spending only 7 or 10 or 14% of their time supporting the Lincoln School District. So a closer approximation to the cost, the time, the resources that would be devoted to a Lincoln School District were attempted to be represented. I think we used, like, for folks like Floyd and I and Katrina, 30%.
38, yeah, we went 33.
And Floyd has had some conversations with business managers from the other 2 supervisory unions that might receive Lincoln, if that's what the state board decides, to try and have some. It's not apples and apples because they're currently supervisory unions and we're not. But to be right, so how it's allocated is a little different because it's different scenarios. But to have some of the same concepts applied in how the allocations are happening to the extent possible seemed important. So they've had conversations. Work is underway right now in all 3 districts to do this work. And so this is informed by those conversations that have been ongoing. And this can evolve over time. This is obviously a first look, and there are a lot of moving pieces, but it was important to think about what this would be. And so this becomes important because now we're obviously going to peel off all of those centralized expenses from what a district budget and MAUSD budget that we've had in the past. And what gets added in is this assessment cost for each of the 2 districts. And so then we run those figures in those other 2. But if you were the supervisory union board, if you were the ANESU board of PAST, you would see a lot more detail of what makes up the 8,797,000. And historically, there hasn't been a lot of talk about how to assess it because it was always ADM. The new SU board, if it's formed, will have to have some conversations about all the assumptions that Floyd and I are building into how this is assessed. And they get to say it's reasonable, it's unreasonable. And this will get fine-tuned.
Nobody gets to vote on it other than the board.
Nobody gets to vote on it other than that board, the SU board. So with that understanding, now we'll work in a MAUSD that is a 4-town district in a supervisory union. Again, all the same assumptions, and there are a lot of assumptions even in that SU assessment that we just looked at. Same idea with fund balance. Enrollment isn't really different from what we looked at before. Same as class size. Class size guidelines. This is where it starts to get different. So what you'll notice if you kind of get right down to the spending per equalized pupil is this is probably the lowest increase in the cost per equalized pupil of the options we've looked at. What's important to recognize is it is the lowest financial impact, but there's an opportunity impact in terms of the resources, right? A way to think about it is if you had to spend 30% more to save 10%, I don't know that you would see that as a gain. Right? So if, let's say it's a 10% reduction in cost, but a 30% reduction in support, as we talked about, the example of Floyd and I, the net isn't necessarily a positive to MAUSD. That's sort of the narrative that we've been talking about in terms of the impact of moving from a supervisory district to a supervisory unit.
Isn't there the likelihood that there would need to be additional staff to administer?
And that's built into this.
That is built into this.
Specifically, it would be the addition of an accountant. Because we're going from one budget to 3 budgets. So that's factored in.
So what if? We'll see.
But Lincoln wants to be able to pay for that.
Yeah, so that would be, so the cost of an additional accountant, obviously we're assuming what that cost would be because we don't know who the person is.
But also be.
But that's a direct cost that would be included in the assessment for Lincoln schools.
And this is primarily because now we're getting some revenue.
No, this is primarily because instead of an MAUSD budget that includes everything, our financial office has to manage a Lincoln budget, an MAUSD budget, and an SU budget.
Well, but you're
No, I'm saying the reason why,
No, this.
the reason why we have a 2.96 here is because now Lincoln is picking up some of the central office costs.
Correct.
Well, we're counting the student.
So we're not kind of.
No, well, this is.
Because this is just
MAUSD.
Generating revenue
I see.
from tuition.
That's the same with the others.
Peeling out
Right.
that.
But the difference here is because now we've broken out some of the expenses. And Lincoln's paying a share of those, and those expenses, what the delta of that's coming back in at a reduced number.
Correct.
So it's, before we were putting a whole bill. And in this scenario, Lincoln's putting $880,000.
Well, we were, before we were, as we are now, we get 100% of his services. And 100% of.
No, I understand that now Patrick's working, overtime for the same amount of pay,
Mhm.
theoretically, sort of speaking.
That may be how it plays out. And it also may be, I don't know how many more hours are in a day, but what the concept really is, you get less of
We
it.
just get less services.
So I guess that brings me back to,
The voters won't care.
if I can say this politically correct. So we talked about. I'm trying. Because I was gonna say it a whole lot different way a minute ago. So
Chocolate anyone.
we talked about the bean counting aspect of it. That's pretty straight, you hire another accountant. But what about the whole concept of curriculum coordination and all that kind of stuff? Because I heard quite a bit from some of the other SUs when they were talking to the state board about having to be a supervisory unit, the board, they have to supervise the districts and they have to go and make sure, road trips over the mountain in the winter. So there's a certain amount of supervision to right where the coordination with Lincoln, which is more than just hiring an accountant.
Yeah, so that same approach, like assuming this supervisory union wouldn't look to hire 1.4 superintendents to do the work, the same level of service, the assumption here is MAUSD gets less of the superintendent's time, Lincoln gets their share of that. The same approach was applied in this scenario to those curricular supports.
Why wouldn't they?
Why wouldn't they hire more?
Why wouldn't you have handle staff for those functions the same way you would for the accounting functions?
I think in part because when we look historically, when we were NSU, we had similar structures in place. What we got for a return on that was, I would say, quite different than what we're getting for a return on those services now, and with the streamlined governance structure. And when we were in SU, we did have an additional accountant beyond what we have now. So it was sort of the, like, this has to pass the straight face test was sort of the approach that we took. And this seemed to do that more so. And it's still huge. Like we've had lots of conversations, Floyd and I, about like the assessment has to be fair and defendable. And in doing so, it's going to have a significant impact on Lincoln School District. So trying to keep all of that in mind as we work through this really kind of played into it.
We haven't got to the tax base.
Yes, sir. Right, so the one, like that assessment, they don't have a say in that number, really, except for this, their board structure, making that decision about that either. So regardless of their own budget, that is being added on to it.
Right. So that's the challenge, right? So from a Lincoln School District perspective, there's essentially three components to their budget. There are the direct costs to the elementary school, K-6 or pre-K-6. There are the tuition dollars that go to wherever they're tuitioning students to. And there's the SU assessment if they're in an SU. They have no say over the SU assessment, other than whatever representation they have on the SU board. They have no say on the tuition dollars. Other schools set the tuition and they pay. The one place where they have control is at their elementary budget. If the SU assessment in this example is, if they're anticipating a $300,000 SU assessment, and it comes in that as an $800,000 SU assessment, that $500,000 comes from one of two places: increase taxes to generate that, or reduce spending at the elementary school alone, because they have no control over tuition and they have no control over the SU assessment.
And it's one second thing. As somebody who has really explored the governance model pretty thoroughly many times, I feel like just looking at the cost of this is totally we're missing the mark. And so I mean, it's nice that the cost is what it is, but it is a really big difference. The reason why we are in the position we're in is because we've been in a merged district, and I don't want us to forget that part of it. So all of this would essentially just go away for a lot of us, being part of a supervisory union instead of a supervisory district.
Well, I think,
This makes it much rosier than what it actually would end up being.
well, it makes it rosier for us.
Money.
Yeah. This speaks directly to what people were saying earlier about whether or not Lincoln is paying their fair share as part of the MAUSD. They may be paying much more of their fair share in this scenario, which is why it's less expensive for us.
Right. The governance.
So they may be seeing more of the real costs for them in this scenario.
That's okay, I'll ask.
So in terms of a threshold, this puts us under the threshold relatively comfortably. 203,000 is less than 1% of the spending. And so when we look at the tax rate, I'll get right to it. pretty flat. For those, the 1/3 that pay based on the value of their home,
So this.
I mean, why did it say 0.8? Looks a lot bigger.
80 cents.
What was it before? 50 cents. Right?
The scenario just before with 4 towns, not in an SU, was 60, between
Oh,
60 and $65.
I'm off by 2
This
cents.
is 80 cents.
Sorry. Yeah.
It's give or take a $60 per $100,000 difference. And then a decrease of about a little over 6% for those that pay based on income, assuming median. And so now if we think about the impact, as we were just sort of talking about the SU assessment and its role in the budget and impact and all those things. So if we play this out, and I want to set context here. So we asked for and were given a draft budget from Lincoln School District that had almost all of the expenses accounted for in there. It had sort of an empty line for SU assessment because they could make assumptions, but didn't really have information to use to make an informed decision about what that SU assessment might be. So as we've been building what that SU assessment would be, we used their budget figures and then plugged in the SU assessment. And this is the result of that. So again, all those same assumptions that we were looking at for the others, lots of assumptions built into what the assessment would be.
I back you up for a second.
Sure.
The assumptions, we use their assumptions. And there's no assumption for an increase in medical insurance on their end, for example. There's no inflation factor in theirs. And not an apparent one. So
Okay.
it's
So good point. So maybe not the
it's their
same
numbers,
assumptions
not our
then.
numbers.
But if they're getting a first year budget, they wouldn't necessarily increase, right? But I'm expecting some of these numbers that we're talking about already in the first budget.
If I were building a budget, I would be using what I expected to be paying for medical insurance, not what I paid last year.
So that's what they were doing. Correct. Last year. Correct. I suppose.
And again, because it's budget season, by last year, Floyd means this year.
Yeah.
We always have to remember that.
Okay.
So again, this is the same sort of line before. You see 62 instead of 65, because as I said before, this assumes those 3 students that are at Lincoln Community School on a tuition waiver return to the school in the town where they reside. That might not be true, but that's the assumption that this is built upon. You can see the average class size anticipated at Lincoln. Then we get to the expenses.
Whoa.
So total expenses with the SU assessment built into that, just about 4.8 million. You see the revenue and spending. We mentioned before the 172 equalized pupil projection that's made. And that math produces a cost per equalized pupil that you see here.
And that increases over the
Increase
general
over-
USD version, correct?
Nope, that's over the current, this year, MAUSD cost per pupil.
That's when.
Yeah.
It's obviously not compared.
Not comparing exactly, just comparing to now. So obviously that looks like a pretty steep increase. The impact in terms of the threshold. So this becomes the concern. You might recall 2 years ago, they're blending together now, maybe 2 retreats ago. When I was sort of presenting about concerns, my concerns stemmed primarily for Lincoln because of limitations on if something's awry, where do you go to trim? The only place to trim is at the elementary level. If this is true, and the one promise I would make is this is not accurate, right? There's so many assumptions built into here. But if it is $1 million over the threshold and that came back and they were in a position to have to find $1 million, they have to find $1 million out of the elementary school. Or raise taxes.
Quarter, but
Right, something a sizable piece of it, or raise taxes or some combination. So that becomes the concern about what does that do to either the tax rate or student services or both, it creates some real challenges potentially. And then we look at what that does to the tax rate, and we'll kind of walk through that quickly, what it means in terms of for the 2/3 that pay or 1/3 that pay based on the value of their home. You can see that translates into a potentially large number. Important to remember that taxpayers have to say yes for this to happen. Taxpayers can protect themselves. And then for those that pay based on their income, at 2/3.
I have a lot of questions. But one is, with this is based on the 9.9% assessment. And in the olden days, when we did ADM, what percentage would that be?
Do you know, Floyd, what the
Yeah.
ADM would be right now? 7%?
It would be, if you're rolling the high school kids in, it's 14. Without them, it's about 5.5%.
Percent.
So in calculating EDM, that would include their secondary students, so.
And to give you the basis, our current structure was earmarking about 195,000 as their assessment for the central office. Generally, equate that to 3 buses at 180. The 15,000 was everything else.
I guess I'm trying to figure out like, how much lower does that percent, like, is that 35.91% increase still a pretty big number if we used ADM?
We should.
I'm just wondering like what the range is. There's a lot of ways, right, to do the SU assessment.
Yep.
So I'm wondering what that, range is or the projected tax increase.
That could be information that's brought if we end up with this budget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say I think what we talked about last time we were here, we said the range is 600,000 to 900,000. I would say, Floyd might know, I would feel like if we move to straight ADM,
dollar
we're probably still in that 6 to 90, right? The dollar amount that would be assessed to Lincoln
Okay, that's what I'm just trying to.
probably stays in that same range. Would you say, Floyd? So lots of information, super complex. I apologize to folks that are going through the budget process for the first time. This is unusual. You may never, ever see this again. I hope you never do. The takeaway is, again, the 2 places you can look at really are the cost per equalized pupil, or where are we relative to the spending threshold if we had a spending threshold. I feel like this is perhaps a place we could go because of what I said before. In keeping spending in line with what that trajectory was, probably positions us pretty well in the future should some sort of spending cap or limit or restriction be reenacted, whether it's this one or some variation on it, probably has us in decent shape. Completely disregarding this has risk. And frankly, probably trying to adhere to this has risk in terms of the impact of trying to control spending. So,
And I'll add, if we used a conservative inflator for that threshold bill, and depending on what neat and when is the statute that we follow to reflect what that increase or what that change is. So it could have a much larger increase than we're projecting as well. I would expect it's going to.
Yeah, there's falling construction numbers that say you're low.
I'm getting a message from our timekeeper. So, I'm wondering if we can put a pin in this, because we're gonna come back when we talk about setting a budget target. And we have a lot of folks waiting that probably want to go home, so can we switch back now to the ends discussion? Hold that thought, put it in the parking lot, and then we'll come back to it. But, can we move back to the monitoring report for? All right, so so we need an action item to approve the monitoring report for 1.1 core subjects in a digital and global environment, 1.2 life and career skills, 1.3 learning and innovation skills.
I'll make that motion.
All right, good stuff.
I'll second.
Chris, Chris, all right. Patrick and Katrina, take it away.
Yeah, so I think the report was distributed electronically with the packet, I think, right, last week. We have some hard copies for anybody that wants a hard copy up here. I think the report mostly speaks for itself, but we'd be happy to answer questions. And I did ask building principals to be here tonight. I think historically, when we've had conversations around the ends, there has been sort of a natural interest in understanding more from a building level perspective, some of the work that's going on related to what you're seeing in the ends. And I think it's important, you know, there's a collective ownership over the results that you see in there. So having principals present in that regard is important as well. So thoughts or questions on the report? It probably looks pretty familiar.
Seems as though a couple of the assessments you now have more, we've had more cycles of it. Have a better
Yes.
Picture of the map stuff. particular.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just dive right into the thing that concerns me the most is why we're seeing such a precipitous drop at the higher grades over one site. I can't imagine that's how we're delivering service. Suspect that that's socioeconomic factors outside of our control. I don't know how everybody else.
Which one? Yeah, where?
Can you be a little more?
Well, the
specific?
SBAC is the easiest one to look at.
Oh, so at the SBAC, or
But
that
it-
one assessment.
Well, yeah, but it kind of, some of the other ones kind of reflect a little bit of the same thing. It just seems like there's a,
Looking at grades 8 and 9 in particular, you mentioned a precipitous drop. Is that what you're
getting down into the.
Yeah, I mean, that becomes the challenge, right? Is unpacking the various layers. Because there isn't one thing that contributes to 18% proficiency in grade 9 math. There's a myriad of things, and understanding what those are and how to approach each of those becomes the.
Well, I mean, it also could be something as simple as there's very little incentive or interest in performing well in this at that age.
In the behavior.
So I know nothing about any of this. I'm just, it's a gut reaction to what I saw. I don't know if anybody had any.
Let me just clarify for folks in the audience. I would say at any point in time, as we're having conversations, if building principal or otherwise has something to contribute, jump in. Okay, there's an open invitation.
So I've got my poke is, and it kind of goes along with what Steve was saying. I didn't look at one particular thing. And oh, by the way, I strongly believe in reading tests, and I believe strongly in math tests, and you can make all sorts of excuses why the numbers are they are, but they're so basic and they're so easy to measure. Um, they tell a story, but there's this ongoing difference, significant difference between kids that are in the category of low income subsidized meals or whatever the correct term is, and kids that are not. And we've been doing this triple tiered system for 3 years now, maybe more. And I know in the past, on the street, you'd hear all these people that it's the wrong thing to do and we're not doing it and it's a waste of time. So there's a very negative connotation to that introduction of that system, if you will, which is intended, as I understand it, would start closing the gap between those two bars, if you will. And I don't know if there's still some issues or resistance to that, but I guess I'd like to know a sense of if people are coming to grips, are we learning a better way to do it? Are we applying it better? And should we be seeing those? And why, if that's so, why aren't the bars closing?
Okay, we're unpacking, we're asking a lot of questions that we spend a lot of time considering as leaders and as an organization. I think the answer to your question is, are we getting better? Absolutely. I think every year our multi-tiered system of supports, MTSS, gets stronger in how we're implementing it. It is definitely evolving. And we're not seeing the results right now. Which is frustrating, and it's why we have to keep working at it and keep getting better. And some of this takes time. I think when we first talked about some of the shifts that we were making around that multi-tiered system of support, even when we were building the strategic plan. So without a pandemic thrown in the middle, systems change usually takes 5 to 7 years to begin to see results. I don't know what the impact of the pandemic in the middle of that 5 to 7 years is in terms of that timeline, but it doesn't shorten it. So there's an aspect of this that is a timepiece, and it's an aspect of us getting better at our craft and implementing our systems more consistently, greater fidelity, and progress monitoring. That is a part of this, and understanding, really looking at it from a scientific lens. What's the efficacy of our core instruction? What's the efficacy of our interventions? And doing that, and we're getting better at that, and we have more work to do.
Sarah?
Is there, I mean, I like when I see it like grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, but I know we've asked this before, but the idea of like seeing sort of one cohort of like, here's the same group of kids and here they are 3 years in a row, and would we see any kind of what Kevin's talking about in some of those scenarios of comparing receiving and not receiving? I'm assuming that means services, or it means free lunch. I'm guessing that's what that means. So the not receiving are students who are better off. Yeah.
So
and they are higher on the curve, but I'm just curious, if we look at the same cohort, if we would see that.
So
graph
Katrina
differently.
can attest to this. The first place I go when the first draft of this is on my desk is I follow cohorts over time
Okay.
to see what is, because it takes some of the variables out, not all of them. There's still loads of variables, but it helps us to see what impact are we having over time on a cohort of students. Some of the variables are that what students are asked to do changes.
Right.
And different people have different opinions about is the change in expectation from 3rd grade to 4th grade as significant an increase as the change in expectation from 6th grade to 7th grade or 8th grade to 9th grade. Different people have different opinions about that. But seeing over time, are we closing the gap or is the gap growing, is important. I think I spoke to that in my narrative a little bit.
Yeah.
Looking for some of those trends. And there are some things to celebrate. I think I started with some of the the strengths that we see, and some of those were in following cohorts. And in a really strong system, we can overcome differences in cohorts and should show consistently a high percentage of students being the standard, regardless of what the particular needs of that cohort are. Because if we really apply that, right, if we accept that student outcomes are different because the particular needs of a cohort are different, we're essentially saying it's the students. Like we're sort of putting the onus on student outcomes on the students, which isn't a healthy place for an organization. Like if you believe it's the students why we're not achieving the way we want, why would we change? We need to own, to Kevin's point earlier, we need to own these assessments collectively. I think putting all of our eggs in any one assessment basket is not a good practice, but we need to collectively own the outcomes and look internally to see what do we need to do differently to change these outcomes, not wish our students were different in some way, shape, or form.
So I think I just tried to figure out how to look at a cohort.
Yep. I get the ruler out.
And,
draw lines.
And when I look at it, and I have the lens of teenagers, and I'm just wondering, and maybe Sean has thoughts about this, but just in general, like, you know, what do you see? I mean, what themes do you notice when you look at cohorts? I know, at least from my perspective, I have a lens on how teens have really struggled and continue to struggle in different areas. So I'm imagining that is reflected here, but I'm just wondering, like, what you guys think. Like, what are some of the themes of different cohorts that are really having a hard time, or ones that are really not gonna know?
I'm definitely happy to have Shannon elaborate. Where my mind goes with that is, I do think teens struggle. I think a lot of students have struggled with this, maybe teens more than preteens. But I don't know that Mount Abe teens have struggled more than teens in the state.
Yeah, well, that was the
And
other
so when
thing
you
I
look at
noticed,
the
totally.
relative, yeah.
Right, and that's the other part, is like how we're doing compared to the state. I didn't get to that part of my ruler, but in the other stuff, I see that in a lot of places where we dropped, the state also dropped.
Yeah.
But either way, it's a drop, right, in a competition. I was just sort of wondering.
And that's kind of a clarification of my earlier statement, is that it seemed a big jump down for everybody,
Yeah,
not just us. We're a little worse than the average, but and I don't think the way we've been delivering education over the time span we're talking about here has changed significantly enough, nor have the kids changed in their educational capacity to explain that drop, other than outside factors. So that's just the kind of thing I took away from it without it being written somewhere in black.
I mean, those 2 grades lost a lot of time in school.
Well, at an age where they're much more aware of everything else that's going on.
Right, they're not in the same. Their strategies and how much they did at home is way less than what you might have done as a junior or senior who had, like, was more task-based, or I don't know, like, just at a different point. That age group.
And on the other hand, there's really encouraging signs that the Lord. So maybe points to the other.
I wonder, you know, it makes me think about our earlier conversation about SEL updates and just like how helpful it is to kind of put into context this stuff with what's happening now. And maybe we would consider at some point, like, it might be interesting to have, like, and I think Aaron sort of mentioned this, like, have a conversation with these awesome folks here about this. Like, what do you guys think about this? Like, have a couple of key questions that we just talked about together. So I would love to hear their lens on this. And I feel like that's just a moment in time, but it's so illuminating, and we have those conversations with staff a couple times. Yeah. Anyway,
How about now?
Yeah.
Anybody have thoughts they want to share?
Well, sort of on the spot right now, and maybe that works.
Their
Yes.
world is on
Yes.
the spot.
However, but also,
And maybe there's not, and that's fine. But if there are thoughts, I don't want to. Supposed to feel like I can't share.
Would be interesting for the board perhaps to look at some of our map data. Data and a more regular assessment that we did that's a little more integrated into the whole of teaching and learning that happens regularly in the school, whereas as it's an event, it's, you know, it's big, it's very rigorous, there are some things that can't access it. But when we look at the math data, that's more guided, you can see student growth. And growth over time between these testing. We'll talk about what we're doing to support those kids to increase their growth. And I feel like that maybe more of a might give us a better picture of how our students are doing, and we could look at it for many years. And this is part of our local success. So my mind kind of goes there as a, you know, looking for real information without kind of everything that goes along with how we interact that data, and how seriously kids took it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I just think that maybe that would be my collective concern. I think that why part of won't be better. I don't know, it's just the thought that I had. I was using that data to really inform our assessment process, and to look at all the students why we institute a literacy program for all students. To increase their comprehension, their study, things like that. So it's just kind of a quick.
My own kids know their math scores. I would just say that when they are
Oh, yeah.
typically able to reflect on, well, it went down like 3 points, but I expected that because and like had a kind of, I don't even know what their scores are, but they were way more aware of it, and it seems a little more individualized. So I agree with Shannon that it collectively is a good look, but also I think that they respond to it because they've been kind of going with that data themselves.
Yeah, they're able to set goals and try to meet them if they're aware where they think the effect of the results come out, you know, months later. Very
Sure. Sarah, did you bring us?
Well, I don't know, this connects more to Krista, what you were saying a couple of times earlier about temperature checks within the school. So, and I was gonna bring this up at public comments. If now's a good time, I can throw it in now. Or I can wait till public comment. You know, that someone mentioned that connecting to the data. My suggestion was, you know, you were looking for a 3 times a year temperature check. Update, SEL update for, I guess, from Patrick. And I wanted to offer that we set up through the work of you and Elizabeth Marr, have set up these staff board conversations, which I very much enjoyed a few weeks ago, meeting in a small group. But they've been very structured where they provided topic. And I would offer, and this is really what the teachers envisioned more, was less, let's all talk about this one topic that's given to us that we can't really control anyway. And more, let us provide our successes and our concerns 3 times a year from the teacher perspective. Here's what's going great, what we're feeling really good about in our schools. Here are some tricky things that are coming up, and we think you should be aware. And that way you don't become floored by, oh my gosh, where did this crisis come from? We never heard anything about this. I would just offer that. If you'd like to hear more from teachers, instead of being given a topic that we
Yeah.
can or cannot
I appreciate that. I did
Control.
just want to clarify for the last topic, actually Elizabeth suggested.
You know, of course.
In that case, she suggested. it.
No, I
But
totally understand.
I appreciate that.
So sort of getting back to the. As policy, one thing I also noticed in here was there was a discussion about the fact that you now have a cohort that has PLPs all the way through the 4 years. Did I read that right? They've been, if you have a personalized learning plan that they've executed for their whole tenure. Is there any way to tap into what's going on with that program in this report? I'm not quite sure exactly how that would be manifested.
Right, that's where my mind went, is tap in what way. into
I mean,
that.
I don't know enough about the PLP process, whether somebody actually looks at that at the end to see if the students feel that they achieved what they set out for themselves. And is there some way to collect that result?
Shannon or Katrina, can you speak to just the PLP process and sort of helping share what that looks like?
Yeah, I think the section that maybe you're referring to, Kevin, was in the high school section that we graduated a class that had completed a PLP as a graduation requirement their 4 years of high school.
Right.
And so there is part of the PLP, kids are asked to reflect on their learning, their transferable skills. There's an opportunity for goal setting, and perhaps that would be where it would fall. Again, I think the goal setting would be around the assessments that we're giving on a more regular basis, such as the math, as opposed to the SBAC, because there's so much time in between that I think it's challenging for students to reflect back on something that happened, 4 or 5 months ago. Like, will they remember what the writing prompt was, et cetera? But I think the end with the PLP would be through goal setting.
So I'm curious, when you say they provide kind of a self-assessment at the end of how they did with.
So they take the math assessment, and then they get their scores. They talk about the scores with their teachers, they reflect on those. With the teacher, they may identify areas that they need to improve on, utilize fit time for additional instruction. We use that data kind of on a different level to say, like, are there kids who are in need of more supports? And if a student needs that, that would also go into their PLP because it becomes part of their course, the courses that they're taking. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, I guess I'm sort of just trying to understand whether or not in the PLP process, the kids are theoretically setting some of their own goals for themselves in a PLP.
Yes, it's all about them.
Right. So at the end of that process, are they, in addition to reflecting maybe back on their assessment scores, are they reflecting back on their own achievement through that process of their own goals that they set for themselves?
Yep, so as seniors, they present their PLP this year to their school counselor, or our proficiency-based learning coach. Last year was our director of school counseling, and they look at what they've accomplished over 4 years, kind of starting at the beginning and telling the story of, here's where I was in, 9th grade. Here's what I wanted to do. Here's where my interests were. Here were the classes that I took. And then how did they evolve over their 4 years, and where did they end up?
That's a fascinating story for me. If a kid gets to the 12th grade in the PLP process, they're like, yeah, I had all these interests and I managed to educate, or was helped to be educated on meeting those goals. Check mark. Good. But how do you report on that?
Well, that's.
Yeah.
You're obviously not going to do it personally.
Yeah, we had this conversation about the senior interviews for the last couple of years, which it seems like such rich data that you could be providing you at the end of their career at MAUSD. but they are iterative stories. They're so qualitative, and the couple times I talked to the various folks who've been running it over the few years, trying to make it quantitative, they were so fearful that that takes away the experience.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it might be something as simple as whoever is hearing these things has a little rating score that's not shared with the kid or anybody else. They just say, hey, look, what side of the needle does this particular story make me feel like I want to rate this? That's it, you know. And are we seeing out of the whole cohort that most of the needles are on the plus side, or try not to get too down in the weeds with it, but it just does seem like a pretty strong indicator of.
I think.
And how to
that-
make it more objective and not
motivational.
subjective, that becomes the trick too.
Yeah,
is- yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think the challenging part of having a rating scale is that by nature, them completing their PLP and meeting all their graduation requirements through their course of study, they have met our expectations for learning. And the PLP process is a way to have them reflect back on that and kind of showcase it and brag a little bit at the end. So, maybe it's more, anecdotal comments of, like the aha moments that kids have that would be more useful. I'm just not sure that there's a good way to quantify it. There's a learning scale that goes with kind of that evaluation of the PLP. But the richness is in the conversation of the student presenting their PLP to somebody.
Well, and obviously I'm not suggesting we rely on this as the whole picture either. And I don't know in that kind of a process, how easy it is for students to share things they didn't think went well. I don't know if that happens as well, which is also useful. In some respects, more useful for us down the road. So anyway, that's just something that struck me when I was reading that particular thing, was that might be a place where we don't think we're seeing the whole picture. Maybe that's where the picture might get a little more focused.
Do you find that, sorry,
No, go ahead.
do you find that there are themes for PLP goals?
I think it really varies. I think the biggest thing that kids set goals for some kids, it's just to get to graduation.
Sure.
For other kids, it's a particular college that they want to get into. And for some is I want a full-time job. I want to be able to start, an XYZ business, whether it's the family business or something else. So I think it really varies. Like a lot of the goals are a little bit broader. And for some kids who aren't sure yet, they may not kind of articulate what is coming for them after high school until 12th grade. Sometimes halfway through or towards the end. And then when they're younger, when they're in 9th grade or even 7th and 8th grade, the goals are a little more specific. Like I want to meet with this meeting in all classes. I want to get forward in all these classes. So I think it just really ranges.
Yeah, I just think as to Steve's point of presenting sort of the anecdotal evidence, themes really tell a lot about what's important to kids, right? And so if in 7th and 8th grade, the themes are proficiency, but in 12th grade, it's like, I'd really just like to get paid. That's a huge difference, right? Why it might not be, we do have some of the math data of math and stuff. And if in 12th grade, you just want to get paid, it might not matter so much that I could read on grade level, as opposed to getting really good scores in the money matters, right? So that's a huge part of what makes up the importance of the numbers that we're reading. So just something to think about.
Yeah, I think to build on that, I would encourage us to think about how valuable qualitative data is, and it takes more time, but it really has huge merits in terms of equity and inclusion, and for kids that, you know, may never, like the kids receiving services that may never be proficient in a certain area, but still have a really important story to tell about their growth and learning. And there's a woman, I think I mentioned her to you, Katrina, her name is Karen Vogel. And she's a data and assessment person in Burlington, yeah. But this is a passion of hers, but I'm sure, you know, other people are thinking about this too, that there are a lot of ways to really share people's stories and successes. And if we're trying to make it be quantitative, we're gonna miss so much. And if we don't tell that story at all, we're gonna really, I think maybe not do justice to a lot of what our students are really have achieved and accomplished, so.
Another board member, Kimber?
So I've got this standing comment that the ends policy is more aspirational. And it would be, it would be really nice to have some sort of a step gauge that we could see progress as opposed to trying to always look at the Hail Mary pass. That's gonna get us to this, if not perfection, just shy of perfection goal, if you will. So I think one of the things I kind of missed about the areas of improvement in the ends was the conversation remained very, very high level, like the policy is, as opposed to stepping and saying, okay, and I don't know what they are, but next year we should be able to see X. You know, in 5 years, we should be able to, we're projecting to see Y or something of that nature. Because I think it's unfair to the superintendent to have to go and say, and granted, there's all these great things going on, but to always say, because it is reality, there's always room for improvement. And I think it's unfair to have him to say that every year because he hasn't attained perfection. And for us to receive that and like, okay, you know, it's just, there's something missing.
Yeah, I guess I'd agree. I mean, it'd be nice to understand out of all this data that's here, what would constitute a clear indication of moving in the right direction from the data standpoint. I know you're feeling like the way you're operating and, you know, the team has gotten things under their wheels now and, you know, they're moving in the right direction. It's not supported by the data. So what level of data change here would constitute for you? And not to put you on the spot, so you got to answer that right now, but that's the thing to think about is what would constitute moving in the right direction and a fairly clear sign of success.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like there might be two different questions in there.
Mm-hmm.
One question is, what would it look like if we were moving in the right direction? And another might be, what would the data show that would enable me to report compliance?
Well,
it might be two different things.
No, I mean, the compliance thing goes to Kevin's question, because the way that it's written for the monitoring report is that you have to meet 100% of everything. That's a lovely sentence.
I would report compliance if we were at 80%.
So that's kind of, I guess that's what the question is, you know,
right?
What help us to set a goal for you that we can feel comfortable with. We can debate it and talk about it, but then we can set it as a goal that, you know.
But I guess that's the point where I was trying to parse that out. I think there's I can report compliance at 80%, and we're unlikely to be at 80% next year when we're at 30 something or 40 something right now. So what would be those incrementals, as Kevin was talking about, that make us feel like we're moving in the right direction, even though I would report non-compliance probably still.
Sure, and the moving in the right direction would be part of the discussion at the end on how we're coming into compliance.
Right.
I remember in the strategic plan, we started with setting these specific
Lots of
benchmarks.
conversations about that, didn't
timelines.
we?
But maybe it is as simple as, you know,
10% better.
that we're going up or we're 10 or whatever it is. And if you don't get the 10%, then you talk about why.
Yeah.
Right? And what you're gonna do different. Because I think, you know, it's less about you're not compliant or we're not compliant.
Right.
It's more about like what do we need to do?
And for me, it's how are we trending, right? And I think you mentioned earlier, I think it was you, Steve, who mentioned we're starting to build some longitudinal data around, in particular with some of our local assessments. We anticipate the repeated reset of the baseline with the state level data is anticipated to reset again in the near future. So all the more reason why having a local comprehensive assessment system is so important. And that's probably what we would look more to see how are we trending. I think you're inevitably going to have some of the ups and downs, but are you kind of up and down trending in the right direction or not, or is it flat? Sadly, I would say for the most part, we've been flat for decades. And we need to change that trajectory. And I think sort of to a comment you said earlier, Kevin, there is no Hail Mary pass. The only path to improved outcomes for students is a lot of hard work, diligence, and continuing to evolve and get better at our craft and build stronger, better systems. There's no quick fix. It's a lot of hard work over an extended period of time, which we're engaged in, and we're not seeing the results yet. I still feel good, sort of the inputs, outputs, right? I feel good about the inputs, like the work we're doing, the systems we're building. It's the right work, it's research-based, etc. And we have a lot more work to do to implement them consistently and with fidelity across all environments, across all of our schools. Like it's a kind of a big ship to steer, right, in that direction. And I'm confident over time, I'm still confident, somehow remaining confident over multiple years of sort of stagnant data that it's the right work and it will produce the results.
This might be a weird plug, but Krista did send us something that has a lot to do with this and linking out with your thought exchange thing. So if you haven't done it yet, which I have not, it's probably a good idea to do it while it's fresh in our heads because it ties directly to this. And then
And you can
it
do it
is
again,
a
too.
broader community look at this kind of policy also. So is that your intention?
And you can do it again after this conversation.
Right.
You can do it multiple times.
Bailey.
On page 5, I saw data about SBACs and grade level and free and reduced lunch and students who receive special ed services. Do we have data on the students who did not access the SBAC? Like what percentage of our students and what grades did not partake, maybe because they had a portfolio or other plan?
So not just students who didn't participate, but participated in an alternative specifically.
Yes.
We do. I know Beth is on. I don't know if you have that off the top of your head, but I don't think it's
Very small.
right. That's why we can't report it. Like we can't report results of that because
Even just a number, like, oh, there's only 4 or there's
like
25.
how many
Yeah,
students
I'm
took an
just curious how
alternative
many
assessment.
students took the alternative.
It's a single digit, you know.
Perfect. No, that's fine.
Okay.
It's less than 10 lines. I was just curious. Okay.
Yeah.
I had somebody asking me a question to ask, which was, it looks like we've taken the SBAC scores and we've broken it into socioeconomic and special education separate graphs to segregate out that data, but it doesn't appear to have been done for many of the other assessments. Is there a simple explanation for that? Just time or difficulty in breaking that data apart to do that? Or
Well, to be quite honest, the state's portal does that disaggregation for us.
what's
So
that?
The Vermont State Portal does that disaggregation, SBAC
Or
does
the
that
SBAC, right.
disaggregation for us. That's already done.
Okay,
What you see on those graphs on
Yeah.
page 5.
right.
We have the ability to disaggregate our local assessment data by those profiles as well. Again, I wouldn't be able to share those results by grade. Like you see your 6th graders math data, you see your 12th graders English proficiency scores. I'd have to do larger groups of grade levels to give you more of that data, which may, to Shannon's point earlier, be helpful moving forward to not just show the 6th grade math scores, because our 3rd through 10th graders actually take the math assessment. So we're probably at a point where we could share more across those grades, even though that pushes the boundaries of what you've identified in your interpretation as N.
Hmm.
But we show you all the grade levels for the SBAC. That's mostly because they become public, so.
Right.
Right.
So it's really just trying to guard privacy more than,
It's an end size issue.
What, any last question? For right now? On this subject? All right. If you filled out a worksheet and you'll get it to me, then I'll attach that with the response form. So before we vote, based on the information provided, does the board find that the superintendent's interpretation is reasonable? Yes, for a thumbs up, no, for a thumbs down. All right. Does the data demonstrate the accomplishment of this interpretation? Yes, up, no, down. Sideways. All right, so I'm gonna call that a yes. All right. Okay, so all those in favor of approving the monitoring report for 1.1 core subjects in the digital and global environment, 1.2 life and career skills, 1.3 learning and innovation skills, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, so that one passes. Thank you all for your work.
And you're welcome to stay for the rest and
You're welcome
also
to go.
welcome to leave. if, prefer not
Thank
to.
you.
Great.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks. Just a data dump. Yeah, instructing.
It doesn't.
It's an interesting.
I mean, it does matter,
It
but
is. It's an interesting question though. Yeah.
Right. Do we need a 5-minute body break?
yeah.
All right, 5 minutes and then come back fresh and quick. We're gonna be quick,
Quick and fresh.
concise.
put the trash, freshly quick.
Oh,
there's
not
not
even
two fences.
All right. Continuing on, we're moving down to an action around the career change incentive. It's a little hard to take action since we don't really know what the action will be, so.
You
Would
want
you like to discuss it first and then move to an action?
I'll move to,
There's
I
no
think we can.
approve or decline or,
Yeah, there's no,
so.
Do you have anything for us to chew on?
I give you a lot to chew on with the budget presentation.
I mean,
My,
specific
so
to
my,
this.
my recommendation would be to not offer the career change incentive for next year.
I was gonna say with what you presented, I didn't see a reason why we would.
And
So I'm gonna move, we don't offer a career change incentive.
Is there a second? I'll second. All right. Discussion.
If we did offer it, how many teachers would you think would take advantage of something like that?
you know, it's really hard to know.
Because usually it's when they're within a couple of years or so of.
Yeah, there's language in the contract about what makes you eligible. I think you have to taught in the district for 20 years. Yeah, and I just think, I mean, part of the strategy around the career change incentive is like when you utilize it, like when you exercise that option in the contract, you want it to be really enticing and you want a lot of people to take it. Because there's something coming up that you're looking to reduce staffing potentially pretty significantly, and you'd rather do it through a career change incentive than riffing. When you fall into, and this happens in some places, when you fall into a practice of year after year, it's always granted. It's not an incentive anymore for people to say, oh, I don't know when they're going to offer it again, I better take it now. So it's not as effective a tool if it's offered regularly. I think we could very well have years in front of us where the need is greater, and we may count on this tool more so than we would in next year's budget, which is in large part why I'm saying I don't think offering next year is the right year to do it.
It also seems like it would be good to hold on to veteran staff. As long as we can,
Well, we have a shortage of
that's what I mean.
certain aspects of staff as well. too.
Encouraging people to leave right now is maybe not a great strategy.
Sarah.
From a budget perspective, I'm going forward in future years. I don't know if this is part of the contract, but I am surprised, I'm gonna say, that it's not expected that you're going to say you're gonna take advantage of such a thing by. I work somewhere where the date that you have to declare that is months earlier. And so from the budget perspective on our side here, I'm surprised our date, that we're not asking for someone to kind of commit to retirement isn't, like, my date has already happened, just to give a little perspective. So, and I'm not close to retirement, but I feel like we would want to be having this conversation sooner in years later and making this, that would be my recommendation for the future.
So that has been a topic of conversation, and the date that's currently in the contract is an earlier date than what was in the contract.
Okay.
And it's January something.
And January 10th is what I
It's-
have, but I'm looking.
That's-
It is the absolute latest we could possibly receive the information and have it impact the budget. And the thinking behind that was there was a concern about the time it takes to get an appointment with a retirement office at the AOE and really understand whether you could take advantage of it or not. And so having it sort of as late as possible, but still within the budget building window is kind of where it landed.
Our teacher retirements are often more complicated in the fact that the date that people are allowed to sort of retire can be something like, November 12th, and you're like, well, that doesn't really help me. So sometimes there's like partial, whatever, so you sort of have to plan for that in advance anyway, so I kind of feel like, since I would imagine staff already is having to plan for that a month, it could make a larger difference for the greater picture than and only 1 month difference for. I'm not trying to be against staffing, because I am on myself, but
Plus you're only convincing half the crowd, you have to convince
I know,
It's a negotiated thing.
right, that's interesting. I was curious. That's what it was.
Yeah, the date is negotiated.
Okay.
If we have to, in the budget scenarios, there was potential that we might have to, if then riff some people, would this be a better solution if that were to need to happen? Or
This
because
is definitely better than riffing. I don't know.
maybe it still
Yeah, I'm
won't
not
solve the
sure.
problem.
Yeah, and I'm not sure we'd have to necessarily riff in some of the other scenarios. The only other one I think would be the 4-town SD, right? That was from an MAUSD perspective,
Oh,
that
yeah.
was a worst case.
And that was
in an
if
SU, the
all
money
Lincoln
works out.
teachers, okay, so yeah, no, okay.
Karen, when was the last one we offered?
I have to look, it's been a few years. Looking over the floor, but
This would be year
Oh,
3.
no. When did Helen return? Sorry.
yeah, it's been, I think 3 or 4 years. I think
Yeah.
it's been a few.
It's been a while.
And
There'll be time.
in that time, we haven't riffed anyone. We've not filled positions. So
Right.
we would be in a very, very different place if we haven't in most of our recent years been taking advantage of attrition. So we've been able to achieve greater savings using that mechanism than we would have if we use the career change incentive. Right, so the best case scenario with a career change incentive is someone gets 2/3 of their salary. They're usually top end salary folks because they have to have so many years in the district. And then you not fill them, but you're paying 2/3 of that salary to be able to not fill it. When someone leaves and you don't fill that position, you spend nothing and you get 100% of the savings. So that's what has positioned us to not have to offer the career change incentive to realize the savings and not riff someone. In a situation where riffing was unavoidable, that's when the career change incentive as a tool is really important.
Anyone else?
I'm just sort of wondering if it's advantageous to offer it, knowing that there will be turnover anyway, and that it'll be reasonably less expensive to have newer teachers than older ones as you're building further budgets.
They aren't there.
Sorry?
I don't think they're there.
I think that's the piece, historically speaking, it has never been a question if there's an opening. Can you fill it or not? Oftentimes, so 10 years ago, it was if there was an opening, if you had a 3rd grade classroom teacher opening, you had 100 people apply for that job. Now, you might get 5. If you had a special educator opening, you might have had 20 applicants. Now, 0.
But the thing that we can't lose sight of is if somebody takes this career change thing for the next 3 years, you give them 2/3 of their salary.
It's 2/3 broken up over 3 years. Is that what you're referring to?
2/3 of their annual salary.
2/3 is the total. And it depends on what option. There are different ways that dollar equivalent gets paid out. It's paid out in money, like direct money to the individual. And if they choose that option, it's over the course of 3 years that it gets spread out. They could choose to purchase health insurance with that, which is spent over time. The one that has the greatest impact immediately is if they choose to buy airtime, which is you can buy years of credit into the retirement. So if you have enough years in that you're eligible for the career change incentive, but you don't have enough years to be fully vested with the state teachers retirement system, you can buy years of experience with that money. And that's upfront, that's all paid in
So
this
the
budget.
final impact is within the next budget year. What's the financial impact?
Depends on which option they choose. It could
Could
be
be
this
3
year,
years.
it could be this year, next year, and the year after.
That's why the career change incentive number sometimes doesn't match the budget.
And is that part of an SU assessment or is that part of an FD assessment? We were there.
That is a specific contract provision, so that would be specific to the district that has that contract. Perhaps both districts in an SU scenario would have that same language. But it wouldn't be an SU assessment, that would be a direct cost of the district, I would think.
But a special educator is under a different contract.
Right, so if a special educator took this, the delta, whatever that might be, of the career change and their replacement would fit under the SU budget and therefore the assessment. And it's not always a savings, it's usually a savings, but it's not always a savings with career change. If a very veteran person leaves and we pay 2/3 of their salary to achieve that, and we fill that with a middle to upper experienced person, it's actually an added cost. And even with that, my messaging to folks that are on hiring committees is always hire the best person, not hire the cheapest person.
Okay, all those in
So the
favor?
question
The
is,
question is, the motion was not to offer. So all those in favor of not offering the career change incentive, please say aye. Any opposed? Any abstention? Right, so. That passes and we are not offering it this year. All right. Next is an action item to set the budget target. Wait, maybe Steve had an idea. This has been chewing on.
Throw a dart.
Yeah.
No, I mean, worst case was 651. Best case was 2.8.
You're talking about percent increase in the cost per equalized pupil?
Yeah.
2.9 was 1, 2. 6.51.
We didn't get the very last number though, right? There was one more budget or no? Never mind.
That included our assessment.
Can we set a target to when things are known to keep it at the anticipated, what would have been the anticipated spending threshold?
Yeah, so I think, so options in terms of the target that we could work with, I think you can set a target that is a percent increase of total expenses. Because that historically has shown up on a budget. Percent increase in the cost per equalized pupil, because that historically has shown up on a budget, and that's the number that really drives the tax rate. And, relativity to the previous spending threshold, obviously with assumptions about what that would be now, I think is another target that you can choose.
Can I ask a clarification?
Mhm.
There was a merger with that. We would just combine these two budgets for this year, or would you have to go through this whole process?
So the thinking that has happened thus far has really been, we would combine the budgets because it's the same staffing and it's just like,
Hold for the first
Exactly.
year anyway, okay.
Yeah.
So that would be scenario.
Yeah, which one would we be? Well, we don't know because if Lincoln chooses not to come back.
that's probably a whole.
Oh, I
different
meant scenario 2. That's scenario 2. Ish. Potentially,
That's
could be
scenario.
3.5.
I wasn't gonna bring this up. There are scenarios that could be our reality that are
Right.
not accounted for in what I've prepared for you today.
Right.
For
I'm
example,
aware of that.
we could be in an SU with Addison Northwest and Lincoln. That's not here.
They could have broken us all up into little pieces.
We
No.
could
So-
be in Addison North District and an SU with Lincoln. But these seem like gave you a sense of the range of impact and are some things that we could work from in some of those other scenarios.
But the second scenario is the mergers.
If it was a merger.
Lincoln's completely separate. They're not even voting.
Right,
Yeah.
so then it's a 4-town MAUSD
District. without-
district that we would then just add to the Addison Northwest.
Okay.
district budget, and that's our new budget. If we're 33 million and they're 25 million, 58 million is the Addison North budget.
At that point, we would want to pay attention to around what their percentages were. And I would imagine that we would want to be a little bit equivalent in our spending. Or how we look at things. Some number should be a little bit more range.
Well, with the tax
Except
rates
that we're
and the tax rates,
individually in very different places.
That's true.
They're
And
they're
then-
up against a more challenging financial situation today than we are today. We're both on the same path. They're just a few steps ahead on that
Okay.
path. So they
So
may
never
have to
mind.
take different actions
Okay.
than we might have to right now.
So the other thing to remember is a target is a starting place, and if we get a better picture next month. And the target
We can
is
revise
too
it.
much, we can revise and come back.
I think 6.5 is high %.
Yeah, I was wondering what, if you could remind us what, like, how far above the threshold that is.
25K.
Versus
No, that's the first one.
Oh, 6.3.
High in the
Yeah, 675.
For 6.5.
I mean,
Right.
That
the 6 point-
option.
yeah. So that option that is 6.5% increase in the cost per equalized pupil is a total of 675,000 over what would be the spending threshold.
and that option is the one where we. Yeah, doesn't. Who knows if that one's gonna. But that's us without Lincoln. So. I don't know, what if we shoot for 4?
So I was
Mhm.
thinking,
I was thinking that we would stick with Nate's suggestion,
Let's need some.
5%.
Something that's along those lines is make it a number that starts with 4. 4 point,
Oh,
anything in that 4 to 5 range.
yeah,
Historically, when you looking at. So following the year when we had, let me get to it here. Where we had the 8.1% increase in the cost per equalized pupil, the following year was 4.6, and from a taxpayer perspective, I remember that passing. Pretty handily. 8.1% did not, so. It seems like that sub 5, although last year was 6.34%. I think there was some sympathy in the pandemic, et cetera, in some of the recent votes.
Yeah.
But I think a sub 5% increase, especially when anyone was paying attention to inflation, et cetera,
Last year didn't translate into a tax situation.
Yeah.
because of the yield, right?
Yield was low.
I mean, I guess I'm just
And we still have a
worried,
favorable yield, that's helping us, but
I guess I'm just worried if we, we go lower than 6.51%, and by some magic wand, we do end up MAUSD as we are now, then we're gonna have to do some major. Well, I guess
that's where the
we'll
target
look at
matters,
that
right?
when
If the target is sub 5%, that's still gonna put us over the threshold. And that's why that's
you just,
sub 5% is different than a target that is relative to the threshold. So if the concern is really staying within striking distance of the threshold, you should set a target that is related to the threshold and not cost per equalized pupil. Cost per equalized pupil is what drives the tax rate, and that's what people are paying attention to, especially with the spending threshold on hiatus.
but that's would be like a what percent increase then? What, like no more than what percent increase? That's in these-
Well, we were
in these-
$25,000 over at 2.9.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just,
So 2.9 is.
3.69 increase in spending, 3.87 increase in cost per pupil.
I'm thinking if we kept it sub 5, 4.6 or 4.8 or whatever, and. The threshold isn't gonna be applied. But if we were trying to stay within, I think that's still kind of within shooting distance of it. From a budget standpoint, where we have a $1.1 million education reserve.
That was like the $60 raise
No, it was
for
The
like
first
on the
one was
tax rate
$30.
estimated. The
And
first one
this
was
is an
30.
upper limit. This isn't like, we could
Right.
make it better if it turns out.
Right.
But to
Right.
Steve's point, we are positioned to be able to basically buy ourselves a year to figure something out if there was, if a spending threshold did get enforced again, and we were well above that and had to respond, we have the funds to be able to buy time.
Well, I think even if we set it at 4 point, the goal at 4.8, it turns out that. It really is a 6 point something equation, and we don't want to rip people. I think that's that's why we built the education reserve fund.
Right.
So that we'd have the flexibility to push that up if we saw a need come January.
And I think there are so many impactful variables that even though it said 6.5%, if you gave us a target that's 4.8 or 4, not sub 5 somewhere, I don't think that's unreasonable.
Yeah.
At least, and maybe we'll learn more that makes me think otherwise, that it is unreasonable. And when we come back, we can say, so here's the target and here's the impact and here are my concerns about that. And then we go from there.
Yeah, I would rather do that than tie it more closely to the spending threshold, because that feels like, I understand the concern, we don't want to get too way out of whack, but I also, just, I would hate to squeeze our budget so much that it would really be a stretch to make that calculation work.
Because that's the needle you're trying to thread. What's the most we think we can spend to provide the kind of programming we want and get a yes from the voters because the tax rate is acceptable.
And be close to what we
And not get
think might actually
totally
happen politically.
killed in a couple.
So I'm certainly supportive of the sub 5. Like that term. The other thing I want to ask the question is, one of the concepts that Nate had was weighted student funding. And we as a board haven't taken any action. That doesn't mean it can't be considered by the administration, I suppose, but I would like to think about, or as we go down through this budget cycle, I'd like to think about that. Maybe if we don't even if we don't do it, how does that realign dollars with buildings? And maybe there's a trial run or something that, or do trial runs before we actually do something with it. But it is one of the things he brought up that we should be looking at as far as aligning capabilities. The whole cost effectiveness, goes hand in hand with that, aligning what you're gonna support each building with. And now's a great time to start thinking about that.
Maybe they have a lot of numbers. Or a little bit.
Well, we could talk a lot about that.
I didn't hear that.
So we could talk a lot about that, but
About what? What
well,
now?
we can
Looking
get
at
the
the time
funding,
now.
but
Oh.
if we can move on to the next item.
Well,
Do
we need a motion.
I make a motion that we set the budget target for between 4.5 and 5.
I'll second.
Just to clarify.
Percent increase in equalized student spending.
And we can change this number. This is just.
This is just a
This is the
target.
target for the next draft
Okay.
that you see, which will
Oh,
hopefully be
we're
a
not
single
done
draft
yet.
for the
I
next
know.
one iteration.
Any other questions?
That number would mean you're looking for places to take money out. Or no? Because
Well,
if
that
it's
Depends
like,
on
what
what
happens next.
decision the state
well,
board
that's
makes.
sort of what I'm saying though, because that. Versus plan could be a big squeeze, but okay.
Theoretically.
I think it's a reasonable
theoretically,
squeeze in the worst case scenario in terms of a squeezing perspective. It feels like a reasonable squeeze to me. I'll look to Floyd to give a nod to that, but
Well, still holding out hope that Lincoln will say, yes, I want to come back. And then we're working off the 3.87. We can
Expand our.
There's the
program.
Hail
There we go.
Mary Kevin was talking about.
Now, I should clarify, in the scenario where we are already without change, well under the 4.5, I'm not hearing you say, go spend more money.
No,
No. No, I don't think anybody
Just thought
said
I'd
that.
clarify. That's, I
All right,
think I've got it.
Hedging between the two scenarios.
all right.
Yeah.
All those in favor of setting a budget target in between 4.5 and 5% increase on equalized pupil spending, did I get that right? All right, please say aye.
I,
Any opposed? Oh, great. Any, anyone opposed? Any abstention? All right, thank you. Okay. Next item was is an action item to approve a board statement inviting Lincoln back as a member in MAUSD, and that arrived last night, sorry, under separate cover,
sure, I make a motion that we invite Lincoln back
using this statement.
using this statement. Thank you for writing it.
I'll second it.
Right. It's also a message to the State Board of Education and the Commissioner of Education. All right, so Sarah and Steve, any discussion?
So I think it's reasonably clear that we're inviting them back into a supervisory district. It's said twice in there. I guess the other thing, just to state the obvious, is if they come back, they'd be coming back to their building.
That's why I've interpreted this as well. That basically, we can't say we stay as we are because they are currently not a member of MAUSD, but we would go back to as we were pre-May 18th last year.
Which includes their building.
So it's not just.
Building,
for
debt.
students. Well, why, I
Everything.
mean, it doesn't have to, we could be inviting Lincoln
Just
back
the
with just the students.
But we still own the building right now.
Right.
Right,
So
So the
But that-
invitation wouldn't.
that would be a transfer, I think.
Oh, I did.
But I think,
clarifying.
but to clarify, yes, that's how I have interpreted this.
Yes.
And
However-
important to understand how it would be interpreted if it were otherwise, if you're just welcoming their students. You would essentially be welcoming them to close their school if they wanted to. Which probably is a different
Different numbers.
They've been pretty
message that
clear.
you're sending.
Yeah, I think they're coming back. This is an invitation to rejoin us in the school district
That's right.
and a message to the SE and the French.
What I see this as is really, it's almost like a putting your money where your mouth is sort of approach, right? This board has made comments in a couple of different ways at board meetings and in front of the state board about wanting Lincoln to remain a member town in our SD. This puts some meat behind that with a statement from the board.
And I drafted it this way because after the discussion with the resolution, I heard a message of, isn't there just a different way we can say it? So I drafted it in this way. as a
And its
starting
response to
place.
that, I mean, the state board was very interested in there being a local solution to this, that they don't have to come in and feel like they're a heavy hand no matter what decision they make. The only local solution that I'm aware of is for one party to initiate a process to officially invite them back. That will take months to play out. But if there is a reciprocated interest, that reciprocated interest sends a message to the state board that a local solution might be possible.
Does this letter only go to their board?
No, I think it probably would be sent to the state board. They have a new chair now. It should probably go to the new chair and to Jan French as well.
Is there a way to have it more public? Are we allowed to post it?
Well, you could decide that a little later when and let Erin know what to put in her meeting highlights for tonight. 'Cause
Well,
they-
I can't remember, but it was addressed to 4 or 5 different entities.
Right.
So I would assume it would go to all of those?
Right, the Lincoln School District, the Lincoln Community, the MAUSD community, it's out there. It's part of our meeting. It's the public record, so it goes.
Oh, it's not current. Record.
So
we
vote on
Well, anything that is shared in the course of the meeting
Yeah.
becomes part of the public.
No, I
record.
understand that, but it wasn't previously shared.
I guess.
Right now, it's not public.
Right, it will be attached to the minutes,
The only people who have it are
right, just like if
board members with an
we,
email.
we handed out something.
So my point of asking that question is that particularly over the last few weeks, friends of mine that live in Lincoln, multiple friends have said, we didn't know, we didn't hear anything, and I just would love to like make a billboard or something saying like, I want to make sure that everybody can access this statement and that they don't have to look anywhere for it. They like open up a paper or open
That's
up a
the part
Facebook
that we have
page.
anywhere.
Right, and so I don't know if there's.
We don't have a giant.
Billboard.
It does flash every time you go to the school websites, the latest thing. So there is often like
You can
something
convince-
that says,
Convince people to look at the school website.
I know, but I'm just saying that is, you have to like click to get out of the announcements at this point, when there's a new announcement. So I'm just throwing it out there.
Great.
Any other? Kristen or Liz, do you have any comments? Nope, they're both shaking their head. All right. All those in favor of approving the board's statement, inviting Lincoln back, that will be put in the minutes and spread around there. Please say aye.
Aye.
All right, any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. The community engagement update was included in the packet, and Krista just has one little piece to add.
Yeah, so I'm not even entirely sure any longer who is on the committee from this board. But also I realized that our meeting is in conflict with the information meeting for the merger. So the update says November 2nd, but that's not a set date. And I'm not sure when to schedule this meeting. And so if I know who's on the committee currently, I can figure out what time works. The next Tuesday is the 8th. And that is,
Exciting day.
wait a minute,
No, it's not. It would have been,
it's not, and it is election day.
right.
And so I don't know if that's not a good time, or if it doesn't matter at that time of the evening. Anyway, maybe we start with who's on the committee, and then I can figure out the doodle poll for when we meet. Any thoughts?
Who's on it?
Raise your hand if you're on the committee.
Liz.
Liz. And here lies the question about committees.
How do you need members? Is that?
Well, I mean, it seems that way.
Well, it's just, we've had, your committee's basically left.
Yes, correct. That's right. We had couple
Andrew
of,
Andrew and Rob.
Lincoln reps that were on the committee, and I think those were the two board members most recently. So, yeah, I mean, it would be good to have at least one more person to move the work forward, because it's hard to do in this space in a timely manner, but if that's what we need to do, that's what we'll do.
So how do you add members?
Usually they self-volunteer.
If you let me know.
What is
It's a
the,
rigorous selection process.
what is?
However,
the-
if I teach you the secret handshake and you're in.
You can fog a mirror. You're in.
Yeah, right.
Darn it.
Oh, no.
So we meet monthly, and, we did a lot of work back when we worked with student permit around solving the problem of enrollment. And then we continued to do a lot of work after that around communicating all the different things happening in the district. And we haven't done much recently because really the merger study committee has, that communication has been done really well by that group. But we have this policy that needs to be addressed, which is ownership linkage. And I'd love to get it going. We can't do that until we have a plan. So we either do that in one of our free extra meetings, which I'm not sure when those, when we will have one.
For a while. There's a free one.
Right. And I'm really good about starting and ending on time, sometimes early. Sometimes even. And community members are on the community, so that's. And we meet by Zoom.
Oh, you do?
Mhm.
Oh, Chrissy.
Good song.
Somebody wants to take my seat on the first center board.
Well, I'd be happy to volunteer for that. I do serve on the library board, so I'd have to make sure that Tuesday didn't.
Is that Tuesday? That's between you and me and Liz. Thank you. Okay, we'll figure out when our date is. And in the meantime, yes, do a thought exchange, do it multiple times. That's gonna help guide our work. Awesome, thanks, Erin.
All right, so we are in need of executive session.
You want to do public comment?
And I would be happy to do public comment first, and then when we come back out of the executive session, we can do our meeting evaluation. Talk about our plans for the next meeting and the highlights, and then adjourn, so that's all that's gonna happen. At this time, is there any public comment in the room? How about online? Is there any public comment online? Okay. All right, well, thanks for joining us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody connected. So. All right, so we need an executive session under Title I, BSA 5313A1A contract, specifically the Lincoln exit agreement. Under that title, we need to establish that speaking about this in public session, we put us at a disadvantage, so we need to determine that first. And then we need a motion, once determining that, to go into executive session. So as we are mid-process, we haven't reached a resolution on this agreement. It really would put us at a disadvantage to be talking about it in public session.
I agree.
Do you need a motion for that?
Yes. We do need a motion.
I'll make a motion. That it would put us at that disadvantage.
All right, so there's Chris, and is there a second?
I will second that, Sarah.
All right. Comment, all right. All right. All those in all those in agreement that speaking about the Lincoln exit agreement in public session would put us at a disadvantage, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Given that is a disadvantage, I need a motion to go into executive session for Title I, BSA 5313A1A, and invite Patrick to join us,
And perhaps Floyd too.
and Floyd.
So
All right,
I'll second.
Steve. And Bailey. All right, and the time is 9:12. All those in favor of an executive session at 9:12 with Patrick and Floyd, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? All right, so we'll go in. Let me get one. We'll get. What do you have to
So we'll
do?
leave. Let me just leave this meeting, right? If we're just coming out and
We're gonna go.
meeting evaluation in the journal, and then we can probably just stay here and we'll close that door.
Okay,
If anybody else is here, so.
So we are now turning off the camera.
so we're gonna turn off,
Yeah, I'm gonna
Yep.
shut this down.
and then I'll log
I
into
can
the
look at the
Zoom.
right screen.
You might want to tell people we're not coming back.
So we're gonna
shut off the camera at this point, and we're gonna handle our meeting evaluation and an adjournment. After we come out of the executive session, we are taking no other action other than adjourning out of it after executive session.
Then
Thank
is
you for
there,
joining us, if you joined us, and
you sent the link right to
yes, to
the
Liz.
online, okay.
Yep.